It was near the beginning of my love for Sega's revitalization, and I had some gaps to fill in. While I had played a lot of their past catalog and all-stars as they're called, there were still a few important pivotal titles that contributed to the industry in big ways that I had been missing out on. One of them was Phantasy Star, an 8-bit Master System RPG that was one of the first of its kind, and a name I knew of for longer than I can even remember. Seeing how it was such an old school title and low-key having some trauma from another classic sci-fi RPG that I did not like at all and still don't like at all, I wanted to play it, but as cautiously and foolproof as possible. Little did I know that it would kick off a series I became head over heels for, in a way I wasn't expecting, but needed. It helped me to re-understand my love for the medium and how that's evolved as I've gotten older, what I continue to look for in a genre I'm clearly obsessed with, and why Sega is a company I will continue to champion for years to come, no matter what crazy moves they may pull next. It's been a little bit since we've talked about the classic series, and now that some time has passed, I think I'm finally ready to dive into the newer entries beyond the original quadrilogy. But before we get into all of that, especially because those games are much longer and will take longer to get videos made, I've compiled all my previous 4 Phantasy Star reviews along with some new commentary after the videos played to quickly go over any thoughts about the games now that they've had more time to stew. So whether you're rewatching these videos I'm still very proud of, need some background noise, or can't get enough of my sensual voice, I hope you enjoy this odyssey we'll be embarking on together. When you think of classic RPGs, your mind goes to games like Final Fantasy, Pokemon, and Dragon Quest, Tales of Destiny, Chrono Trigger, and maybe Shin Megami Tensei, Square Enix, Nintendo, and Atlus, the big boys. But how many of you think of Sega? Yeah, not a lot if I were to guess, and for those of you who do, it's probably for something like this. And that's not what we're talking about today. Sega not being one of the immediate thoughts when thinking of RPGs is a shame because their history with the genre and their approach to how they're designed is fascinating, starting all the way back in 1987 and later overseas in 1988 when they released Phantasy Star on the Master System. A game that I really want to talk about with you all. I've had my eye on this series for a while now as they've been featured in many Sega collections I've had in the past. Granted, they didn't click with me at the time, but as I got older I've wanted to come back to them after gaining a newfound interest when peering into the series from the outside. This quadrilogy tells a cohesive story, so there's a set narrative that's stuck with its ending all these years later, and from what fans say, it's one that's well told across all 4 entries. That sounds super cool, and it's safe to assume they stuck the landing since Phantasy Star IV is revered as one of the greatest RPGs of the time. I want to know how it all plays out, especially because the genre for this series is a hybrid between fantasy and sci-fi. And it's a space adventure? Yes please. Now some of you may be asking how Phantasy Star came to be, right? Well, we're all aware of how competitive Sega used to be, and probably still are. After all, Sonic was made almost entirely to go toe-to-toe with Mario. Phantasy Star has a similar origin story, meant to be the company's answer to Dragon Quest, which was a huge success and a big reason as to why JRPGs became so popular in the gaming scene. It's no exaggeration to call that game the Super Mario Brothers of JRPGs, and thus Sega had to challenge this titan as well to capitalize on its success, maybe even surpassing it while they were at it. Whether that was accomplished or not, that's up to personal preference. This game was a hit, garnering praise for its scope, pushing the 8-bit console's graphics to their limit, and providing such a different experience to JRPG fans as a whole. It was an exceptionally impressive game for the time, but that's the thing, the time was back in the 80s. It is now 2022 and I'm playing this as someone who doesn't really experience all too many classic RPGs in his free time, let alone turn-based games, since I'd rather play any other RPG subgenre before them. I don't hate old games or whatever, but their cryptic instructions on where to go in order to progress and random encounters always gives me more trouble than I feel is worth. I did want to play through this game for curiosity's sake, however, and I figured the few quality of life improvements in the Sega Ages Switch port would help a bit, but I wasn't expecting much. Honestly, the plan was to simply switch over to a fan translation of the PS2 remake after giving this version some time, and experience the original game story that way while hopefully having a cleaner, more newcomer-friendly time. So you can only imagine my surprise when by the end of this Phantasy Star I experiment journey thingy, I not only finished both the PS2 remake and the original, but I haven't stopped thinking about them since. This game, or these games I guess I should say, have been on my mind a lot lately, not because I didn't enjoy them or anything, but for the opposite reason. I like these games. I like these games a lot. And when trying to put my thoughts together, it wasn't making any sense. Do these games fall into a lot of the pitfalls I feel plague older RPGs? Yes! Very much so. Random encounters still suck in this game, and there were so many instances where I had no clue where to go. Not to mention the story isn't all that developed or much of anything in many instances, especially in the classic version. I wasn't big on the music, and while many of the graphical tricks seen in the original were no doubt a sight to behold back in the day, they don't look all that great now, and all of this isn't even going into the gameplay problems I have, especially with the combat system for both versions. But for whatever reason, the negatives didn't stick in my mind nearly as much as the positives, and we're hopefully gonna get to the bottom of all that. I'm attempting to make sense of retro appeal, if you will, and that may require you to open your mind and suspend your disbelief a bit, so bear with me, grab yourself a snack, some water while you're at it, and hop into the spaceship, loser, because this is my revolutionary review for Phantasy Star. Again, if it wasn't already clear, this video is taking a look at both the original version as well as the PS2 remake. Starting with the former, I'm specifically looking at the Switch port released through the Sega Ages line. This is a group of classic Sega re-releases by M2, including titles such as Alex Kidd in Miracle World, Shinobi, and Phantasy Star! Oh my god! While you can play the game as it was originally intended, I opted to play this game through the newly added Ages mode, where the experience and money you gain at the end of battles is multiplied in order to lessen the amount of grinding required. And alongside a lower encounter rate in order to balance out the battle rewards multiplier, and a faster walk speed to make the game more, fun, these quality of life improvements serve to alleviate slower moments and potential tedium, while keeping the rest of the game untouched so the core experience is able to be enjoyed as originally designed. I swear that I never grinded more than necessary or abused any of these added conveniences. Trust me. That sounds sarcastic, but I am serious. The PS2 remake, on the other hand, was played completely straight, of course, only having an English translation patch modded in that I got off of the Phantasy Star Cave. Link in the description. This was a Japan exclusive released under the Sega Ages 2500 series, a lineup of remakes made on a budget priced lower than retail titles of the time, with this being the first of the bunch. To be perfectly honest, this version of the game isn't too well loved by the fandom as a result of that budget, with many citing this being not as good a remake as the game deserved. How do I feel about the matter? We'll hopefully be answering that question over the course of the video, so what do you say we start off with the first thing people tend to discuss when comparing a remake to its original, the updated presentation. Starting with classic Phantasy Star, it doesn't look too shabby, and that's coming from someone who generally doesn't care for 8-bit sprite work. While overworld character sprites are hilariously simple, enemies and battle screens more than make up for them with their detailed looks that feel like they should come from a higher bit console than the Master System. I'd easily call this the best looking title for it. The same kind of detail goes for when the game tosses in the rare cutscene, giving every party member a portrait to communicate with one another. Their character designs are pretty standard for the most part, but Alice sticks out if anyone. Alice? Alyssa? That's another thing about this game we've got to go over real quick, isn't it? This is the protagonist in this game. In Japan, her name is Alyssa. Everywhere else, she goes by Alice. Why? I don't know, why not? Playing both versions back to back with the PS2 version using the Japanese names and the Ages version the localized ones, I tend to flip-flop on how I refer to this cast. However, after asking you all on Twitter, most of you know this girl as Alice, with the rest of the main characters mainly being known by their localized names as well, so that's what I'll refer to them as throughout this video. Cool? Cool. Moving along to the PS2 version, it goes for a hand-drawn style, and while many cite these visuals as cheap and not as good as they could have been, which I somewhat agree with, I do still find them appealing. The overworld sprites do the designs far more justice this time around than before. Monsters still look great, and in battle, rather than a first-person POV, you get a third-person perspective, so you can actually see characters do their commands and whatnot. I tend to prefer this for whatever reason, so this was an upgrade in my book. And speaking of upgrades, the cutscenes. There are not only more of them, but they look so much better. They're all uniquely illustrated to allow for a full range of emotions and expressions, helping to characterize these characters far more than the original game ever could. And thank God they look so nice because you can't skip them. I said it before, I'll say it again. Unskippable cutscenes should be illegal. Pretty sure cruel and unusual punishment isn't allowed in this country, so I don't know what the deal is. Overall, I'd call the PS2 version a step up from the original for sure if we're strictly referring to the ways the games present themselves on a visual level. Again, I will admit that this game could have taken the whole hand-drawn approach a lot farther, and this is one of the biggest showcases of the game's limited budget, but it still looks good for what it's worth. Can't really say the same about the soundtrack though, for both versions of the game. The original's OST is fine, I guess, but super short, and the list of songs I genuinely like is even shorter. I do love the overall theme for Palma though. Phantasy Star PS2 updates the soundtrack and even adds a few new tracks, and somehow it's still worse. Seriously, just compare my favorite song of the original OST to its new rendition. What the heck happened here? It sounds like I'm playing some kind of freeware flash game. There are like 2 tracks here that actually sound better than the originals, but that's pretty much it. I for sure prefer the original OST, but even then, I can't say I'm a fan. As you've probably noticed by now, I'll use some of the game's music in official remixes here and there, but for the most part, I'll be using outside music for the video with all the credit and links to listen to them in the description as always. Going back to the aspect of the presentation I actually enjoy, most of this game's visual prowess is a direct result of the genius art direction with the fantasy sci-fi blend, as it works exceptionally well, much better than I could have ever anticipated. It doesn't even really feel like a hybrid due to how natural everything works together. Like, yeah, Alice is rocking a traditional piece of armor while chopping down dragons with a lightsaber. What about it? Odin can equip an axe for some big boy hits, but can I interest you in this multi-targeting laser gun with fixed damage? One minute you're fighting Medusa, the next you're taking a spaceport to a nearby planet in the Algol solar system. It's all played straight and even more surprisingly, just works. I love it, and I love all of the great monster designs and unique locations that stem from this combo. The Algol solar system consists of 3 planets: Palma, the green one; Lotavia, the desert one; and Azorus, the ice one. A bit by the numbers, but cool nevertheless. One of those taking that quite literally. These planets all house their own overworlds, which in hindsight aren't too big on their own, but combine to make a pretty decent map size, and splitting the world into 3 large sections defined by being their own separate worlds gives this adventure a scope that was unmatched by anything else on the market at the time. Even now it's pretty cool, despite recognizing the fact that the combined size of these maps isn't all that large. It just feels large, you know? The sense of scale is maintained, a feeling that was kept throughout the entirety of the story as a matter of fact. One that takes place, again, in the Algol solar system under the rule of an evil tyrant named King Lasik. Lasik, I don't know, I'm calling him Lasik. Many have tried to rise up and overthrow him, but none have succeeded, ending the lives of many by his hand, including our protagonist's brother, Nero. In fact, that's exactly where we pick up upon starting a new game. Alice discovering that her brother has been killed. Swearing to get revenge for him, she sets off to find a warrior her brother told her about, all on a quest to defeat the evil tyrant, and that's it. Go kill the evil king. As older games did, you could get a lot more background and setup if you went out of your way to read the manual, which after doing just that, helped a lot of the endgame plot points actually make sense, but whether you take that extra initiative to get all the details possible or not, the premise remains more or less the same. Your brother died by the hands of a king mad with power. He gotta go. And that simplicity is carried throughout the entire game. Your goal never changes, and no crazy plot twists ever happen until the very end, which I thought I wouldn't be fond of, but against all odds, this ended up working for me. Right off the bat, I appreciate that the game acknowledges this story as one that isn't all that complicated and keeps story-heavy scenes to a minimum, teetering the ratio of story to gameplay more in the direction I care about the most. And this minimalist storytelling ended up leaving a lot of the more minuscule details up to my imagination. What was the relationship between Alice and Odin? How well does Lutz feel like he fits in? Is Meow a snarky bastard 24/7? It's all up to me, and since these 4 party members are the only ones the whole way through, this mindset was reached at all because I grew attached to them thanks to my time spent with them, thanks to how many battles we fought and won. I was able to forge a connection with them all, not because the game told me how to feel about each one, but because it gave the player enough respect and breathing room to come to their own conclusions. You can call it laziness, but it came across more as an intentional decision around then current limitations. So with this in mind, I really like this party, even more so in the PS2 version where more dialogue was added to allow for more concrete relationships and personality, while still leaving the majority of the gaps to be filled by the player. It's updating a classic experience while still leaving its original mentality intact. No doubt and thanks to most of the added dialogue being optional and primarily to help guide the player where to go next to progress the story when it's unclear, which unfortunately does tend to happen a fair amount. There were many times where I was forced to use a guide and map to tell me the names of locations, where I was supposed to go and how I was supposed to get there after trying on my own a bunch because the game doesn't make that all too clear. Even on the PS2 version, there were still some instances where a guide felt necessary, but to be perfectly fair, I believe the game expected everyone to play it with a manual of some kind that came with the game's original release. Yeah, remember these? Instruction manuals. And they're physical too? Oh my god. They've unfortunately become a lost art these days, but especially back on old school RPGs, they truly were a resource the games expected you to use in order to, instruct you on how to play the game, and in many instances, help guide you on certain story beats. And thankfully, the Ages version of this game has a digital manual in order to do just that. Although it's not as in-depth as the original game's manual was, sadly. That thing even had a a partial map of the overworld, which is weird since it's not the whole thing, but it's better than nothing. This should help you get through some parts of the game anyway, and if not, I don't think there's any shame here if you feel the need to look stuff up. I didn't really mind having to do that here since the journey still felt satisfying to go through. I'll remember what to do in future playthroughs, and I'll want to do future playthroughs because the game was designed in a way to where I don't have to follow this same order of events each time. I didn't expect this going into the game, but Phantasy Star is incredibly non-linear and purposefully designed so that you can go about the game's set pieces toward defeating Lasik in any order you desire. This was no accident either, as the original manual highlights and encourages the fact that there is no one golden path to the finish line. So combined with a simple story and lack of direction, along with the ability to hop between the 3 planets pretty damn early on, the game almost comes off as an open world type of deal. Do you clean up everything on Palma first, or do you perhaps want to head to Motavia? I can fight Medusa right now, but I can also hop over to Dazorus and grab some stronger weapons real quick before doing that. The game doesn't tell the player what to do next because that in and of itself is up to the player. Granted, a map of any kind would have been appreciated, but exploring the game and allowing yourself to get lost and stumble upon major events is a part of the charm and experience you forge for yourself. It's still fine to use a guide in order to have some kind of, well, guidance, but don't be afraid to loosen the leash, especially with this game's short runtime. I only took 9 hours to beat classic Phantasy Star, with a fair amount of that time being spent wandering. This is a replayable RPG designed to be done differently each time, and I applaud that. Kind of a bummer that the PS2 version didn't get the memo though. This version is a lot less lenient on going about the game in a variety of ways, not necessarily due to railroading the player or any kind of story walls, but as a result of failing to balance enemies around the same level. In classic Phantasy Star, the monsters you fought on Palma would be around the same level as monsters on Motavia, with every planet having tougher enemies the deeper you got in, but still being able to reasonably defeat. Phantasy Star PS2, on the other hand, has enemies in certain areas you clearly aren't expected to be able to defeat at certain points, preventing you from doing specific events out of order. This is a bit of a bummer because the non-linearity ended up being one of my favorite parts about Phantasy Star. Why get rid of that? Actually, a part of me wants to say that this was unintentional since enemy levels aside, you still technically have the ability to go about events the same ways as you could in the original, but there's just too much room for level differences this time around. The numbers across the board in terms of stats with your party members and the game's opponents are much higher than they were in the original, with the range being much larger as a result. I beat the original game at level 24, but I beat the PS2 version at level 70, meaning that while you could argue that the original game had some higher level enemies in specific areas, the level range wasn't nearly as wide there as it is in this remake. So I didn't ever notice too big a power difference in my entire playthrough. That combined with the PS2 version taking me around 16 hours to complete as opposed to the original's 9, on top of the extra cutscenes being unskippable, makes this remake a far less replayable version. Which again, is kind of a bummer, but hey, that sort of thing might not even matter to you, and it doesn't by any means ruin the game for me. It just takes away more from my point of this story allowing you to forge your own experiences, you feel me? When reminiscing on this game, I thought back on a lot of iconic stretches like the tower to fight Medusa and get back at her for Odin, the gauntlet of caves on Dazorus leading to a village that felt like a safe haven, barely clawing my way through the penultimate boss having Alice being my sole survivor. These parts of the game hit harder than usual because I felt in complete control of everything happening when they happened. These weren't cutscenes or moments spoon-fed to me, but a self-created story that was mine and mine alone, making for a more personal experience than it would have been otherwise. And it's really cool to see such a big aspect of the gameplay heighten the overall experience, and while I feel like this was also the intention for the game's dungeons, I wasn't big on these no matter which version I played or how I approached them. They both feature first-person labyrinths that must have been mind-blowing back when the Master System was new anyway, having this pseudo 3D look as a result of some technical wizardry, but they just look kinda bad nowadays. The PS2 version isn't impressive in the slightest either, being fully rendered in proper 3D this time around, but just remaining uninteresting to look at. Phantasy Star PS2 has a somewhat dull color palette if I'm being honest, but here is where it's at its worst. Visuals aren't even the worst part though, I wasn't kidding when I called these labyrinths. Every dungeon is a maze, with them getting more floors, traps, and higher levels of complexity the further along you get. They eventually reach a point where they're simply unfun to traverse through it, with random encounters along the way and my absolute favorite feature of any RPG, the problems and annoyances are heightened. Because these dungeons are mazes, their layouts can become frustrating to learn, but thankfully both versions of the games that I played have means to alleviate this. Phantasy Star PS2 has an item you can buy called the Atlas that gives you a corner map for whatever dungeon you're in, allowing you to make a map and use it to find your way through or explore new areas. I like this a lot, but wish there was a way or some kind of stronger item to have this on permanently, as it disappears after so many steps. A lot of my inventory space was taken up by these, but with this game's forgiving amount of inventory slots, this didn't frustrate me as much as it could have. The original version of the game doesn't have such an item, but the Ages version, however, has another great quality of life addition where you can just activate a dungeon map on the UI permanently from the get-go. Not sure why there isn't a world map when outside of dungeons and specifically on the overworld, but who am I to complain? This right here makes the Ages port of classic Phantasy Star the definitive one in my book, as it functions just like the Atlas, having you make a dungeon's map as you go, but never disappearing unless you yourself turn it off. Along with this map having more details, with them notifying the player on hidden passages and floor trap locations, these made exploring dungeons miles better than otherwise, even if I'm still not crazy about them. I understand that the maze-like layouts themselves are the puzzle and ultimately the challenge of these locales, but this approach toward dungeon design just isn't for me. I hesitate to say that I dislike them outright, but they're probably some of the weaker parts of the gameplay experience for me, and played the smallest role in helping me forge my own journey throughout the game's design choices. Something that almost everything else did to a greater degree, including the battle system, which I believe it's about time we cover. The game features your traditional turn-based combat controlling up to the 4-character party. You've got normal attacks, magic, the option to talk to an enemy, use items, like the video, subscribe, and hit the bell for notifications, or just run away. Talking may have sounded interesting, but it's really just nothing. When you find enemies who speak your language or get an item that allows you to talk with enemies that don't, they say a line of dialogue and then just dip. It's simply a more reliable way to run from fights. After all, it's turn-based, so it can't guarantee that when you select the runaway option, you actually run away. Why? Hell if I know, every turn-based game does it and I hate it every time. Sorry, got a little carried away there. Anywho, everything else in combat is pretty run-of-the-mill. Your attack is either physical with a range of damage or fixed with the guns and such. Magic uses MP, items are items, yada yada yada. Although for some reason, you can't pick your specific target no matter if you use a standard item or magic. It's whatever your character decides to do at the moment, and I won't lie, this led to multiple frustrating moments and ruined potential strategies. I don't think it would have been beyond the system's power to be able to pick whatever enemy's ass I want to kick. To the shock of absolutely no one, the PS2 version does not have this issue. It does get rid of the ability to talk to enemies though. Oh no! Anyway, it adds a few more things to combat, so let's get into those. There's now an auto button, forcing everyone to just attack at will if you feel like you're capable or we're just gonna have everyone attack anyway. The ability to guard, which is always nice. A few extra spells for some characters, like a nice element for Meow and multi-targeting spells. And this version even introduces a whole new mechanic in the form of battle gems. These can be equipped to each character's weapon and allow said character to either use the elemental spell attached to the gem or the gem's supportive action. The real depth from these, however, comes from mixing and matching different ones, as characters can equip 2 gems at a time with specific combinations on specific characters, allowing for a 3rd hidden spell, all of which either dealing big boy damage or providing big boy support, like, for example, the ability to revive a fallen ally. Even our boy Odin can cast spells with these, which was otherwise impossible, so it adds more options to the battle system. You love to see it. Here's the problem. The game doesn't tell you which matchups result in a special combination. This would incentivize experimentation, but the list of what 2 gems create a special combo is different for each character, meaning that, say, one combination on Alice isn't necessarily going to work on Meow. The amount of trial and error to figure out just what the heck works with one another is simply too much, and you might as well look up a spreadsheet like I did. Also, the gems stop working really quickly. They break after repeated use if you're lucky, but most of my gems would break after just one use of their combined spell. Admittedly, this does make some form of sense considering how ridiculously strong a lot of these combos are, especially the attacking ones, but this forced me to constantly run back to the one gem store in the entire game to keep restocking. I think it would have been better if we were to limit my special hidden spell to 1 use per battle instead of breaking the equipment altogether. That way we could balance the mechanic out without forcing me to burn through my money in order to keep taking advantage of it. And it would also encourage me to experiment more since I wouldn't have to constantly go back just to buy the ones I like. As it stands, it's a cool idea and an option I definitely relied on a lot later on, but it was unfortunately executed poorly. They did make battles more interesting though, in the PS2 version anyway, as both games' combat systems are pretty bare bones. Not to say I wasn't completely engaged, as some enemy combinations could catch me off guard, but I never found myself as invested as I would have liked. It doesn't help that turn-based combat is my least favorite out of all the RPG battle systems, so it already takes a bit to get my attention, and this game did not do that. Bosses were pretty uninteresting as well. The first one was kinda cool, having the boss constantly apply poison so the status effect acted as a dynamic timer for added challenge, but the rest were just damage walls. Buff your team, hit the guy, heal your party, rinse and repeat. So yes, this is an area where I acknowledge the game's age catching up with it, being dated in a sense. It's an area in the remake where I wouldn't have minded if it took more creative liberties to make it all more interesting beyond just the gyms, but all of that being said, above all, who am I kidding? I still liked it because it acted as yet another instance where the game allows the player to forge their own experience through the ways it's designed. In fact, this was the game's feature that made the whole of Phantasy Star click with me in the first place. It was during one of my grind sessions in the PS2 version. I was just kinda chilling, hanging out with some peeps in my Discord server and relaxing with the game I was really digging. I didn't have to put too much thought into my every action. I found a pattern that worked with the enemies I was grinding off of and stuck to it. But I still got that dopamine from seeing my character's numbers grow. I still enjoyed the fact that my characters were getting stronger. I wasn't necessarily getting any better at the game. I mean, not like there were a lot of mechanics that allowed for this, but I didn't really care. It was just cool seeing growth, if not on my end, then on my parties. And that in and of itself somehow ended up being enough to get me attached to this group. I was seeing these characters grow not in a narrative sense, but a gameplay one. And since this is, well, a video game that allowed for emotional attachment unlike that of what I'm used to. Odin may not have been too prevalent in story cutscenes, but after my playthrough, he stayed on my mind being remembered as my hardest hitter, and a guy that got me out of a lot of tough spots over the course of many battles and boss fights. The guy whose strength I always buff first in the ladder especially. Alice isn't just a badass character with cool moments every now and then, she was my most reliable party member who only fell in battle a handful of times. Those last two bosses gave me a lot of trouble in the original, but each time when my team fell, she remained standing and got the finishing blow on both. MVP of both of my playthroughs without question. Whenever she struggled, that was my indication that I just wasn't a high enough level or maybe messed up somewhere along the line. These characters were ones I grew closer to thanks to the gameplay and this battle system rather than any shining moments in the story. And contrary to what I'm used to, this worked. In fact, it resembled a feeling I got when falling in love with the cast of my favorite game, forging a relationship with them primarily through a combat system where everyone has a role and feels unique. Granted, in said best game ever, they're also just good characters in a narrative sense, but the combat connection was an important factor in establishing them as my favorite cast of all time, and this plays the biggest role in making Phantasy Star's ragtag group pretty special to me, and making the overall journey I took in Phantasy Star special and my very own. How it still works in my eyes. Everything from the freedom of exploration, open-ended character relationships, and its simplistic combat system paved the way for the player to use their imagination and forge their own journey through the fleshed-out worlds provided to them. And it's not like I'm excusing every design choice here, because I'm not. Things like the music, dungeon design, and boss battles still bother me and prevent me from calling this some kind of misunderstood masterpiece. I don't think it is one. But I do recognize that it has merits unique to classic RPGs, and that it doesn't have to follow every rule of what modern RPGs seemingly have to in order to be any good. This ability to craft and experience all your own as a result of the game working around its classic limitations is the root of its retro appeal, and many of these lines of thinking can be applied to other games of this style. And both versions of the game I played are what I believe to be the best ways to experience these titles and help alleviate some of the bigger issues like cryptic progression, labyrinthian dungeons, and an incredibly bare-bones combat system. So for those of you who've been keeping track of the data design checklist, no, I don't care that I have a limited inventory. I'm actually encouraged not to hoard items and use them when appropriate. I don't care that I have to grind every now and then. It can be sort of relaxing. And no, I don't care that I don't always know where to go, because sometimes I need to get out of my comfort zone and just explore, because there are a ton of ways to reach the end of the game. The map is designed in a way that encourages exploration with a minimal amount of empty space due to its density, so just going off on your own and seeing what you can find is really no big deal. The game pushed me out of my comfort zone and opened my mind to enjoying these types of games in a way I didn't think possible. So while it shouldn't make any sense, somehow, some way, I ended up loving Phantasy Star, and it came from a very genuine place. Now, would I recommend this game to anyone? It's complicated. I want to make it clear that none of these apologetic statements invalidates any of the criticism I've laid out, and with the original especially, it can be hard to get through no matter what you do. But I did, and you know what? I'd probably do it again. A lot of this game can easily be seen as unacceptable with the kind of market we have these days and the plethora of options that offer more conveniences to players and whatnot, but I truly believe that there's merit in putting your biases and expectations aside for games on a case-by-case basis and allowing yourself to grow accustomed to what it expects out of the player, rather than remaining stagnant and only playing games that reach whatever criteria you have for what makes a good game a good game. In other words, it's a great feeling to naturally enjoy a game that clicks with what you want, but choosing to like a game, trying to like a game, can oftentimes lead to a feeling just as great, if not greater. I understand that this is a big ask with how saturated the medium is and with all these options available at your disposal, but it's okay to slow down and truly digest the many works of art that make said medium up. And sometimes that requires you to put in a little more work, but more often than not, it's worth the effort. In this case, it was for me, as after years of putting many super old RPGs off in favor of newer ones, after finally trying to enjoy one and put my biases and expectations aside, I found a new game to love and was introduced to a whole new series and its stories it wants to tell. I could very easily have missed this. So even though I'm not really trying to sell anyone on this game, you can do whatever you want, I don't really care, I hope my words stuck with you and that you keep this all in mind. And if you are intrigued, I don't think you can go wrong with either version I played. Both of them excel in different areas. The original is non-linear, replayable, and easy to pick up and run through, especially thanks to all the additions and quality of life features M2 brought for this definitive Switch port. The PS2 version has a lot more substance to its battle system, looks prettier, and adds more depth to the story and characters. Both games give the same core experience, so whichever one interests you the most is the one you should go for, but if I had to pick my personal preference, it would actually be the original. Again, can't emphasize this enough, the Switch Sega Ages port is so good and super cheap. Whenever I come back to this game, it'll most definitely be through this version. Don't be afraid to give it a shot. If you don't like it, it'll only set you back like $8. Good heavens. In the end, Phantasy Star is an interesting first step into the RPG genre for Sega. It's fairly dated and has a lot of strange design choices, but it's all preceded by a truly creative experience that allows freedom in how the player traverses its world and takes on its challenges. The blend of fantasy and sci-fi elements gives the game an identity all its own, and due to its focused cast, one way or another, you may find yourself getting attached. It's a tough game to recommend, but like I said, I'm not really trying to sell you all on this game. I just wanted to put into words how and why it not only clicked with me, but made me appreciate retro RPGs. Honestly, after playing this game, I see them in a whole new light, like I found something totally new to get excited for in this medium. How can I not make a video talking about the game that kicked it all off? However you choose to look at this game differently or not, whether you choose to try it or not, I just hope my adoration of the game was clearly conveyed, because despite everything, despite the admittedly frustrating sections, learning curves, and solutions to problems most modern games don't even have anymore, I chose to love this game. I tried to love this game. I learned to love this game. And when it was all said and done, those feelings became genuine, real, and completely natural. Truly a fitting start to Sega's RPG legacy. I love that video. Well, besides the fact that I was stubborn and sticking with the Japanese names even after saying how I preferred the original. Anyway, this review was an ambitious endeavor tackling both the original and its remake, and I have some updated thoughts on both. The remake, as I brought up in the video, was what I thought I was gonna exclusively play while just giving the original a few hours or so. But even now, I still prefer the OG. Phantasy Star Generation 1 ain't bad by any means though, and despite my preference, I think I can still agree with the notion that it's an easier recommendation to newcomers over the Master System Classic. It's got a cleaner look to it, gives more in-game directions, and offers the characters more tools to be used in battle, while featuring a more modernized level scale and stat spread. It retains a lot of the identity of the original, no doubt about it, but alters the experience in a way more in line with what you'd see during the time of its re-release and just modern JRPGs as a whole. It's a good game all things considered. On the other hand, the original is a fantastic game, and my hesitation towards recommending it isn't nearly as strong as it once was. If anything, I feel that more people could stand to benefit from dealing with its more old school mentality, as it opened my eyes to the beauty of retro RPGs in a way that's still affecting me to this day. I've replayed this one a few times, with one of those replays being fairly recent, resulting in me loving the game more and more whenever I do. It's such a gem and has become one of my favorite Sega games in general, as well as one of my favorite retro RPGs. The 2500 remake may look cleaner, but I do have a soft spot for that authentic vintage anime look this game provided, and how the developers worked around the limitations of the hardware to provide simple, iconic designs. designs. The soundtrack has also grown on me way more. That part of the review is the one instance where I disagree the most. Phantasy Star's Master System soundtrack, particularly its FM variation, is a banger, all 20 minutes of it, and I won't tolerate any slander. Past Zafer was spitting a lot in this video, but that was one of the few instances where he missed. You hate to see it. Gameplay is also a lot more fun than I let on in that original review. Turns out that commentator and viewer, Caddy Grasshopper, was right. I do like turn-based RPGs. I had just been playing the wrong ones for a while. And a part of me knew this. The meme of me hating turn-based RPGs started to gaslight me into thinking it was the truth, but no. Especially after playing a bunch of other Sega RPGs after the fact, even in their purest, this genre kicks ass in ways that continue to surprise me, with Phantasy Star being no exception. As a matter of fact, it turned out that the remake added too many bells and whistles, which ended up bloating the experience to become something less than the sum of its parts. A turn of events I didn't think was even possible at the time. But regardless, at the end of the day, what draws me into this game the most and my favorite part about it all revolves around the exploration, dungeon crawling, and that sense of adventure. This really is an open-ended game, and this recent playthrough saw me doing key events in a completely different order. In fact, the game allowed me to proceed through the final dungeon without finishing all of the prerequisites. And while I was able to hold my own, I just got stuck at a place where I was missing what I needed. A frustrating circumstance to be sure, but I love that the game just lets you do this. There are no invisible walls and very few gates keeping you away from doing certain things out of order. The world truly is your oyster, and therein lies the true beauty of this game, what makes it so replayable, and why it captures the feeling of a genuine adventure in a way very few other games have managed to replicate. And losing that pure sense of freedom is still the main reason why, when it comes to revisiting the Algol solar system in its earliest days, I pick the Master System original every time. So yeah, my love for it has only increased as time progressed. The remake is decent too, but for future playthroughs, I'm almost only going to be doing it through the Switch Ages version. Even with things like the fan retranslation project for a tighter script, I don't know man. That old, messy, lacking translation is a part of the charm, and the mapping feature along with the ease of access on the Switch are all too good to deal without. Someday I'd love to own the game physically, but for now, I suppose I can deal with having its definitive incarnation digitally on one of my favorite modern consoles. Woe is me. Phantasy Star, Sega's premier RPG outlier that took the world by storm. It featured a tightly knit cast that proved easy to grow attached to, and not one, but 3 worlds to get lost in that granted enough freedom for players to go about the game in their own ways, thereby creating an adventure unique and different from one another. It was a success back when it was originally released, and even all of these years later, has proved to be more than capable of providing an enjoyable experience. I played it for the first time rather recently and fell in love with the title as a whole, and even after making my, dare I say, good video on it, I tend to pop in from time to time just to mess around and play it for myself. The game's awesome, and I only gain a greater appreciation for it over time, as it truly helped Sega make a name for themselves when it came to banger RPGs, and pushed the Master System to the point where it feels like it reaches beyond the console's capabilities. Of course something like that was bound to get a sequel, and this time we would push the console even further to explore the solar system to a level even the original couldn't achieve. But would this even be possible for the Master System to handle? We might need something more, something stronger, something... Wait, you hear something? Because I think that's the sound of the next generation! Ba-bam! Enter the Sega Genesis. With a brand new console and 8 whole extra bits to work with, this represented the future of the company, and even today is easily their most iconic piece of hardware. It was cleaner, cooler, and stronger than the Master System, meaning more faithful arcade ports, brand new IPs, and sequels to beloved classics. While one for Phantasy Star was originally planned for the Master System, gears were eventually shifted to the Genesis for reasons that shouldn't be hard to understand given the system's capabilities we just highlighted, meaning the fantastic stars truly were the limit for what a follow-up could potentially provide. And with the developers wanting a stronger emphasis on storytelling, a deeper dive to be taken into the entirety of Algol, and a further fleshed out combat system only capable on the stronger tech of tomorrow, just what was possibly in store for the eager Sega lovers? The answer to that is Phantasy Star II, the much-awaited sequel released in March of 1989 and a year later in 1990 overseas in America. 2 years from the original's Japanese and American release dates respectively, as a matter of fact. Pretty cool how that works out, huh? The original game was a trailblazer in and of itself, but the waves Phantasy Star II caused were unable to be ignored. It crushed reviewers' expectations and was the game to own from fans of the first game, fans of the genre, fans of Sega, and fans of, well, just video games. Were you gonna be the person who chose to ignore what was, at the time, the biggest game available for home consoles? This is a 6 megabit cartridge. Who cares if it was more expensive than your typical cart would run for? Everyone praised the game for its focus on sci-fi elements, its shocking narrative, and the challenging experience coupled with its length, making it worth the price of admission for how long it would last and how much it'd keep you on your toes. There were a lot of expectations to meet, and this game, safe to say, delivered. This was a very important, impactful game that many are still talking about to this day, which leads us to where my story began. Okay, maybe not today, but on my early internet days, my journey with Phantasy Star all began with this one clip.
Number 5.
Phantasy Star II was just like every other RPG when it came out on the market. Just on steroids.
What? The way the game looked, the characters, and it all being sci-fi focused, this game looked different, and I was incredibly interested. And then I got my hands on the Ultimate Genesis collection, played some Sonic, you know, as you tend to do, but what do we have here? It's Phantasy Star II along with its 2 follow-ups, and even the first game was there as an unlockable. This was it. I was gonna play the hell out of this series through this collection, and I was gonna start with the second game. Hopped into the game, and I'll never forget how it went. I jumped right in, watched the iconic opening, get the briefing from the city's governor, and I'm acquainted with Nay. I've got a mission, so obviously I'm gonna go out and do it. Walking speed's a little slow, but that's fine. The game looks great and I'm digging the soundtrack. It almost feels otherworldly, especially with the surprisingly laid-back overworld theme. I can't go past this bridge for some reason. I guess I'll come later. And first battle. Guess I'll pick the fight option, and wait, why am I the only one attacking? Why isn't Nay doing anything? What the heck? Does she not have any weapons? Why are these enemies so strong? What the hell am I supposed to do? What, already? And I'm back at the title screen? I then went back to playing Sonic. You know, as you tend to do. Okay, so maybe I was just a stupid kid who didn't know what he was doing, but while my experience with RPGs was much smaller then compared to how it is now, I think we can all agree that Phantasy Star II was a bit harder than your typical adventure. I mean, I had played Chrono Trigger and a bit of Final Fantasy VI at this time. I knew what an RPG was and how to play it, but the game still curb stomped me, so much to the point where I didn't think I wanted to play it. I eventually unlocked the first game and even tried that, but after essentially the same thing happened, except that time I was even more alone in a literal sense, I found no reason in continuing my relationship with this series. Fast forward to today, I beat Phantasy Star I earlier on this year and I loved it. I want to continue the series, meaning revisiting Phantasy Star II, and despite my early, rough first impression, I'm not weary or cautiously optimistic, I'm actually kind of excited. I still tend to hear this game be brought up when discussing great classic RPGs, and after finding so much to enjoy from a Master System game, I can only imagine what strides could potentially have been taken when jumping to the Genesis. It was time to play the sequel once more, only this time with the intention of beating it. No exceptions. About 15 hours later, I did just that, and much like the first game, it all ended in me feeling tons of emotions I wasn't exactly expecting, and as it just so happens, there's a lot more to this game in question than I could have predicted. With supplementary text adventures, another 2500 series remake, and just a much beefier experience within the game itself, I can now very easily see why so many people are unable to stop discussing this game even all this time after its release. Beyond trying to learn about this game's ins and outs, what it's going for, and how it expects you to approach it, there's so much about it to chew on, and if anything, all of this makes it such a fascinating work of art, one of Sega's most fascinating out of their entire catalog. So we're going to talk about it all, what works, what doesn't, what philosophies were shifted from the first game, how the change in hardware affected the final product, what all these extensions of the game do to expand on the massive experience already presented within the game itself, and why at the end of the day, it's yet another entry I fell in love with. We've got a ton to talk about, so grab yourself some water and relax, get comfortable, and hop into the spaceship, loser, because this is my revolutionary review for Phantasy Star II. When you hop on over to a new console generation, what's the first thing you think of? Is it the new games that'll inevitably push the industry that much further? The better processing power? Or is it how much better everything will look? Because I guarantee a lot of people's minds tend to wander in that direction sooner rather than later. The leap from the third to the fourth generation was a big one for a lot of reasons, but the increased graphical prowess alone is simply staggering. Phantasy Star II, even being an early Genesis game, still looks pretty great for a multitude of reasons. Just on a technical level, I love how much better everything looks in in the overworld. They're detailed to where I'm satisfied with how a character translates to this more simplified style, and just like the first game's remake, everything on the overworld looks pretty good there as well. Gotta be honest though, I'm gonna have to give the edge to the Genesis game here, and that primarily comes from a richer color palette compared to the remake's more washed out one. Also, I'm a sucker for 16-bit, it was kind of a losing battle. The scaling's a lot better in this game's top-down view as well, particularly in the Genesis version, since the original game's remake was already pretty good in this regard, but I highlight that in this game specifically because unlike the former title, there's no more first-person dungeons or a first-person perspective in any part of this game. This was the result of time constraints and the Sega Genesis having memory limitations that made incorporating these kinds of dungeons simply impossible. The game was already packed enough as is. I mean, it was the biggest game in the industry at the time, so I think it's fair that they didn't want to make an even larger ROM size, don't you? I don't really miss them, to be honest. The trick was cool at the time of release, but nowadays I find them to be some of the weaker looking parts of the original game, both versions at that. If I had to choose between these and regular top-down perspective labyrinths, I'd pick the latter, and that's what we got here. Unfortunately, because we just had to show off our fancy new parallax scrolling, every dungeon inside the man-made technological buildings have these ceiling bars or whatever that obfuscate the player's view, and they're so distracting. These do nothing but get in my way. I get it, your fancy new console can do these things, but should it do those things? I would argue no, and I think that at some point Sega felt the same way because the remake thankfully lets you get rid of these, which was a nice touch. The battle screen looks a bit different as well. Most prominently, combat will always take place on this grid that looks straight out of Tron, and while a part of me misses the different backgrounds that all correlated to where you were when you were randomly encountered, I kinda dig it, it looks cool. This is another area where the remake takes some graphical liberties though, offering the option to either have the iconic grid or have these backgrounds based on the player's location, which out of every graphical update or change has gotta be my favorite. This required a bit of extra work to put in, so the inclusion is very much appreciated and I made sure to take advantage of it. You may have also noticed that both the remake and the original version's battle screens are all showcased in the third-person perspective, and that's because we've shifted to just that in the main series unlike the original version of the first game. Like I said with that game's remake, I like this better because it allows us to see characters doing their commands actions, which is nice. Granted, the party's animations are pretty standard and don't have many frames attached to them, but I liked seeing them nevertheless as well as the enemies moving about, especially because, like before, monster designs are pretty good. In this game though, they're called biomonsters, being strange mutations caused by abnormalities within the world's climate due to all of the technology being out of whack. That was a lot of words. The point is, they're allowed to be more creative and almost abstract, making for a greater amount of diversity across the board. Which actually brings up an interesting point about this game, and that's how it tips the fantasy sci-fi scale a lot more toward the science side. This ended up being a point of contention with a lot of fans of the series, citing how the original game does a much better job at having the two art styles work together to create the series' whole identity. And while I can see where they're all coming from, I don't think we're giving enough credit to how big the spectrum of the genre hybrid truly is. There are still plenty of fantasy elements in this game that work well with the science fiction ones, it's just that the latter got a bit more focus this time around for the sake of the story, and maybe even to stick out in a gaming genre that tends to focus on fantasy much more, especially at the time this game originally released. While Phantasy Star II no doubt tells a science fiction story, it still has plenty of fantasy elements and plot points to make it feel like a satisfying hybrid just as the original was, and while the blend may not be as seamless or evenly split, I was more than satisfied with what we were given and remained impressed by how well it all worked together. Just going back to the biomonsters, it's cool that these fantastic beasts are the result of technological failures and tampering. Your party members still use weapons from both sides of the combination, and while I would have liked a bit more variety with my party members, it's still cool to have one of them be a mix of biomonsters and humans. If there's one thing this series is really consistent with, it's the balancing act of the different art styles, and this game is no exception, it just goes about it in a different way that for my money, works. In fact, let's go back to that cast, why don't we? It's a much larger core group this time around, 8 characters instead of 4 to be specific, and they all look pretty cool with their various drip and wacky hair colors. I particularly love Shur and Nay's designs, with Rolf looking pretty clean too. Oh yeah, I should probably mention, I'm sticking with the localized names again. They're different once more, but I think from here on out, I'll refer to everyone in every other Phantasy Star game I may or may not look at in this way, just for consistency. Anyway, where was I? Right, the great art direction. Yeah, this cast looks great. And the rare cutscene artwork in the Genesis version looks pretty incredible. Generation 2 introduces a lot more of these, even more so than Generation 1, but I don't know what it is. But these kind of look the worst in the first remake selection. Maybe inconsistent is the right word, because occasionally these look great. Other times they look pretty off. Even with the new status portraits, some characters look good, others look cheap. It all appears to be done by the same artist, so What happened? Ah well, the character designs themselves are still sound, so it's not the end of the world, I suppose. It's just a little weird. But going back to the positives, even side characters look pretty cool, particularly the various shop owners, and while there aren't many, and of the few I can't even show them due to spoilers, the major antagonist designs are kind of incredible. And beyond the characters, the game does a lot with its sciencey theme, what with the world being split into chunks of land surrounded by techie walls and long tunnels, in-game menus looking like computer windows, and instead of reviving characters upon defeat, you clone them. It's all so damn cool, dude. I love it. Despite the more minimalist menus, with shops, for example, all having smaller menus on a black screen, and the battlefield always being on the same grid rather than distinct locales, I think it all still manages to look impressive. Once again, the remake takes some liberties in adding backgrounds for these few areas that had none, but I don't know, man. I kind of like the minimalist aesthetic of the Genesis version. There's some kind of charm to them that I can't really explain, but I think those who played the game at the very least know what I'm saying. With that last point in mind, the Genesis version's kind of in a weird place where it's ultimately debatable whether it's more technically impressive than the first game. However, I don't think there's any discussion to be had when it comes to the soundtrack. Such a step up, even if it's still pretty small, but hey, quality over quantity, and this OST definitely screams quality, being catchy, memorable, and fitting the whole way through. For every upbeat theme, there's a melancholy one to boot, and I love them all, particularly the boss theme, each overworld song, and all of the cutscene music especially. Great soundtrack this time, you love to hear it. That being said, this remake, like the first game, butchers it, and that hurts a lot more here than the last time because I already didn't care for the soundtrack there, but I liked it here. I wanted it to be good again. The remake does have a few good songs, like its rendition of the battle theme and Secret Ways was pretty good, I guess. Yeah, I think that's it. I don't like the rest of it, and it's all because the tone of every song is so off, making them fall apart. Maybe they were going for a different vibe, sure, I'm all for new takes on similar music, I suppose, but even then, the instrumentation reeks of cheapness. It's all so artificial and soulless. In the original, you had this chilling, alien main theme that had me hooked since day one. In the remake, what even is this? The tone is gone, and even if I tried to shift my mindset to whatever they were going for here, it still sounds bad because of the baffling instrumentation. It doesn't work, so for this video, while I'll be using a lot more of the Genesis game soundtrack, it's still pretty small and you can listen to the whole thing front to back before this video ends, so as you may have noticed, I'll be opting to use external material here to fill in the gaps just like the last time. Anyway, it may surprise you to hear me say this for a variety of reasons, but I have a lot to say about this game's story. Surprising in the sense that I tend to focus a lot more on the gameplay, which I will still do in this video, don't you worry, but also surprising in the sense that the last game's story played such a backseat to the actual video game. And in all fairness, that simplicity and smaller role did a lot to heighten the overall game's experience. The whole point of Phantasy Star was simply getting all of the cool weapons and gear to defeat the Mad King. How you did that was completely up to you, which paved the way for open-ended progression and player expression, while also leaving a lot up to the player's interpretation in the name of encouraging them to make a story separate from their peers. It was great, and the way I interpreted that story was as a fun, planet-hopping MacGuffin quest, all tied together by a tight group of lovable goofballs. There was clearly a lot of hardware shenanigans holding the developers back from fleshing out that story as much as they probably wanted to, but this worked pretty well. Heck, when the remake did have the opportunity to flesh out that plot even more, it chose not to. Call me crazy, but I don't think that was an accident. The way the original story was presented ended up working in the game's favor, so that feeling was better off being preserved, albeit to a lesser extent than the original. That all being said, from the get-go, this sequel was always one meant to not just continue the story of the original, but to do it in a way that would have a much greater emphasis than the first game ever did. Whether the Master System would have been able to handle something like that while maintaining the scope of the original game is a question I don't think we'll ever get a real answer to, but there was no doubt that the Genesis was a console made to handle a game of that scale. So it's ironic that due to the time constraints, change in hardware, and internal disagreements, this game's story went through so many changes that the original draft and idea are all completely different from what we got. Not that there's anything wrong with that, but I do think that there are some areas within this game's narrative, how it's paced, and more prominently how how it's presented, that are a direct result of these developing shenanigans. And for the record, this was something I felt while playing the game for the first time, without my research I did after the fact. So with all that prefacing out of the way, let's dive into it. Just what is the tale of Phantasy Star II? Well, for starters, it no longer shines the spotlight on the previous game's hero Alice, because it can't! Our story takes place 1,000 years after the events of the first game, and the Algol solar system is at peace. Technology has advanced to the point where magic is a lost art, cities house dozens of people living in harmony, and everyone is protected over the seemingly omniscient supercomputer called Mother Brain. Moreover, this world you're seeing, the one we start off the game at and the home of our new protagonist, is actually Motavia, the desert planet from the first game. Hard to recognize, isn't it? The lands are green, people are prospering, and everything sounds great, but things aren't super pleasant for our protagonist Rolf. We actually open the game on a recurring nightmare of his, where he sees a girl fighting some kind of demon. Series veterans may find it to be a familiar sight, and I for one thought it was a pretty banger way of opening the game. Afterwards, things seem to get even worse, because even though Rolf's job as being a hunter meant to protect humans from this world's biomonsters, they're spreading at an alarming rate and it's becoming a concern. Mother Brain is supposed to be protecting everyone, so why is something like this happening? Where did they even come from? It's up to Rolf to investigate the matter, and he won't be doing it alone. He lives with a girl named Nay, who, as I mentioned earlier, is half human, half biomonster. So while society rejected her all her life, he was the one person to take her in. Not one wanting to be left alone again, she leaves with him, and their quest to discover just what the heck's up with the biomonsters, along with their ragtag group they form along the way, begins. Already, the setup's a bit more complicated than before, and a big part of that is thanks to the impeccable world building. While it's not necessary to play the first game before hopping into this one, it definitely helps and already feels rewarding, because seeing how much the world's changed over the 1,000-year timescape almost feels surreal. It's one thing to be introduced and invested in this sciencey world as a newcomer, but it's another to see it after remembering how everything was in the first game. The opening city, Paseo, was once the airport that housed the governor's castle, but now it's a bustling locale with the governor's castle replaced with an information tower, that of which containing a library of resources on the world that anyone could just walk up to, unlike the uninviting moat that once barred off the original building that used to be there. That already piqued my interest. I wanted to see more of what's changed, but that dream, even in my first playthrough where I didn't understand its significance, is such a haunting opener. The music, how foreboding it is, and the somber feeling associated with it all. This is such a great tone setter to the game because Phantasy Star II's story is pretty depressing a lot of the time, a stark contrast to the first game. I suppose that makes some deal of sense though, considering your whole mission begins by questioning whether or not this great new way of life is authentic. What if Mother Brain really doesn't have our best interest in mind? Why does paradise not feel like, well, just that? You're challenging the status quo, something no one else has done to this extent, meaning things won't be easy and there will be severe sacrifice and consequences as a result of what you're trying to achieve. I found myself incredibly engaged throughout the more poignant moments, with the finale to Act 1 in particular sitting in my mind. I didn't think it would get crazier than that, but then Act 2 kept throwing all of these wild twists at me, with the ending being something I still think about a bunch. I sound surprised when I say all of this because I didn't expect to feel this way. I thought the pacing was gonna ruin all of that for me because if I'm being real, it's not great. There are a lot more cutscenes in the first game, but still not as many as you think. The game maintains the early RPG trope of leaving a lot up to the player to figure out, meaning a ton of your progression will hinge on you interacting with NPCs and engaging with their clues and problems, rather than having a clear-cut goal established in a plot progressing scene. Granted, the latter does happen a lot more than before, especially later in the game, but early on this isn't really the case, meaning those big story moments that had such an effect on me were fairly spread out without the most build-up in the world, but ironically they still feel earned and, as already established, made their impact. How? I always felt like everything that happened and every way the game was designed was all in service of this game's theme. For the first game, everything was for the sake of the adventure, the one you made in particular, but in this game, I feel like the theme is to never lose hope even in the face of seemingly unbeatable circumstances. Without spoiling too much, your party takes a lot of L's over the course of the game, and the more you find out about this world and what happened during that millennium between games, only make you feel the weight of how crazy this solar system's truly gotten over time. There are so many moments where Rolf and the crew could just keel over and give up, but that determination to find out the truth, that drive to free the worlds and win back their independence, that willpower to never lose hope is what ties everything together for me, and that alone made me constantly engaged. Even the ending felt like it honored that theme in the best way imaginable, and it's a pretty controversial one because it doesn't offer a lot of closure. But you know what? I thought it worked perfectly for this game and got me thinking. It's pretty open-ended, and for the time, the commentary it provided was unheard of within the gaming industry. A lot of plot points where many players first experienced experience within the industry, which make for some of the bigger reasons why this game is still talked about as much as it is. But it all not only aged gracefully, but made the story stick out even today. It offers enough to get completely invested, maintains interest by never losing sight of a pretty subtle theme, and leaves just enough left up to interpretation and speculation to have it all remain in your mind for a decent amount of time after it's said and done. This is art. I'm all about it, and I really enjoyed following this story the whole way through. It was a joy. Although, that being said, and it pains me to say this, but the cast could have been a lot better. I love Rolf and Ney, but other than those two, everyone else suffers from a lack of proper characterization and interactions much more than the first game's party. There, I was able to spend a lot of time with everyone because I had that same party for the entirety of the game. Of course a connection was going to be formed. Here we have 8 characters to play around with, and I can only have 4 with me at a time. I never felt like I was given the proper amount of time to form connections with these characters, which would have made for a great opportunity to find some way to get more dialogue going between these guys, but that never happened. The remake throws in a few more lines, like the hint dialogue if you're getting lost, and even a few interact with some NPCs here or there, which was nice, I suppose, but with a cast this big, I think I would have liked just a little bit more. Maybe Sega felt the same way because shortly after the game's original release, they dropped a series of visual novels called the Phantasy Star II Text Adventures. These were, say it with me, Japan exclusive and released for an online service called the Sega game Toshokan, where you'd follow one of the party members throughout their origin story in the style of an adventure puzzle game. They all got fan translations, which is how you're seeing the footage of me playing them now, and while they're short, they do a lot to further flesh out these characters. Suddenly, everyone becomes a lot more interesting, but I still think that the cast as a whole suffers due to their lack of real interactions between each other. And while I did end up liking a few more after playing them, like Shure and Rudolph specifically, I think this series tends to benefit more from a smaller, focused group rather than a big ensemble like we have here. My other big problem with the narrative has to be the way it's presented. There are a fair bit of legitimate cutscenes, but this game's story really could have benefited from just a few more. Most of the bigger moments had unique cut-in artwork and upped the presentation for the sake of heightening the moments that deserve to be, well, heightened, which was great, but I wouldn't have minded just a little bit more. There were a few scenes that just played out on the overworld, and no matter how good the sprite work there managed to get or how fitting the music was, there was a lack of any real emotional punch that could have been there if there was a more legitimate cutscene. The remake does a great job stepping up here, having a lot more art for moments in the original game that fell into this trap, but I would have liked the Genesis version to have more since, well, I like the Genesis cutscenes more. While these issues I have are pretty substantial, I'm happy to report that they never outweighed the good though. I loved seeing this journey through right up to the end. It's not just a great video game story, but a great sci-fi story, and I don't see many of those within the genre, especially not during this time. Phantasy Star II doesn't just feel unique, but also sound. It was a great step up and gets me excited to see how much more we can improve going forward. For one of this game's earliest and biggest goals being to tell a much more complex, engaging narrative, I'm happy to report that it delivered and then some. But can I say the same for everything regarding the gameplay? Honestly, it's a little complicated. What say you we kick it all off with the battle system this time? Starting with the Genesis version, you have a few more options than the last time, but the basic essentials are still here. You can attack, use text, pop items, hit the like button, subscribe, and the bell for notifications, which, let me just say, are all probably the best options to take in this situation specifically. Or run away. No option to talk to enemies this time, but since that was just a more reliable means of running that only worked with specific opponents anyway, I didn't miss it and may not have even noticed if I weren't reviewing the game, to be honest. One omission I would have noticed, however, is the lack of enemy HP being displayed. Why do we get rid of this again? Granted, it's not hard to pick up on how much health an enemy has after repeatedly fighting them, but still, it would have been nice to just have been told like in the original. I saw no need to get rid of this. Moving right along, how you give party members commands also plays out a bit differently, in that you have to manually go to the strategy option and tell characters what to do, then hit the fight command where everyone will do what they're told in that fight's turn order. They'll continue to do this unless you press a button where once that round is over, you can give commands once again. Took me a second to get used to it, but this is a great way for making fights a lot quicker since you don't have to constantly go back to the party's menus if you were just planning on doing the same thing over and over again, which I found applicable to me over my playthrough more often than not. And when using finite items or running out of TP, the game's smart enough to switch the character in question to attack so that you don't use more items than you were planning on, or waste a turn trying to use a tech you don't have enough energy for. Not to mention you can actually pick your target this time. Well, kind of anyway. If there are different enemy types, you can select which group to attack, but not the specific target. So if there happen to be multiple of the same enemy, my characters are able to be ordered to attack that group, but which one will still be up to them. This makes it feel better than the last time where I couldn't pick my target at all, but when you really think about it, it's more or less the same, since in Phantasy Star I, all you'd ever be fighting were groups of the same enemy at most. The original never did mix different enemy types in one fight. Now that we are, being able to switch between groups is nice, sure, but I still can't properly order my team seem to take one enemy down at a time, which is a bit more frustrating here than before. Battles are a lot tougher in this game than the previous entry, meaning there were plenty of scenarios where I wanted to execute specific strategies, but was prevented from doing just that thanks to this limitation. I'm all for upping the challenge, but you gotta give me the amount of leeway to compensate, as enemies hit a lot harder and could take a much bigger beating than before. So once again, it should come as no surprise that the remake allows you to do something as basic as picking which monster's ass you want to kick, along with a few other tricks like displaying enemy HP. Thank you. Battles are structured a lot differently here than the Genesis version, with the whole strategy fight setup tossed to the side in favor of more traditional turn-based RPGs. Every turn you're gonna tell each party member exactly what you want them to do, unless you opt to use the auto battle option where everyone will attack at will, just like in Generation 1. Only this time they'll specifically fight at attack level 2. See, every time you order a character to attack, you'll charge up this energy meter from levels 1 through 3, with the higher levels dishing out more damage, but lessening your speed, and lower levels doing less damage but coming out faster. Do you risk taking all that damage for some extra strength on your end, or do you just go for it and hope you can chip away the last of the opposing side's HP? It adds some layer of strategy and is a creative idea for what it's worth, which seemingly plays into the fact that every battle actually ranks you upon completion, with the higher scores netting more experience points and money, and vice versa. Other than that, everything else is pretty much the same, although Generation 2's biggest additional combat mechanic, much like the gems from Generation 1, revolves around the crafting system. When you get new party members in this game, they're all greeted at Rolf's house, and in the Genesis version, they'd just be chilling there until you pick them and add them to the party. In Generation 2, you can have them either practice, which will net them some experience points without being in battle, or create, which will have them craft items exclusively through this mechanic that are used in battle to dish out some additional means of damage. Like Generation 1's gems, there's a lot of method to the madness. Certain character combinations will result in specific items, and you have to go through a considerable amount of battles for these items to be crafted, meaning they're a bit of a hassle to get, but from what I hear, it is worth it. I never use this mechanic though. I was far more concerned with making sure all of my characters' levels are up, since the Genesis version had no experience share mechanic of any kind. Also, these crafted items break after repeated use, and there was already an item mechanic like this in the Genesis version anyway, where specific pieces of equipment also doubled as an item that allow for free tech, those of which being unable to break, by the way, so I wasn't too concerned with the crafting mechanic. It felt superfluous, to put it bluntly. But let's backtrack for a second. No experience sharing in a game with 8 party members? Yes, and trust me, it's as annoying as it sounds. One slightly poor aspect of Phantasy Star I was that every party member joined you at level 1, but fortunately it could have been way worse than it actually ended up being. You only ever got 4 party members including Alice, and you get them all fairly early. You may have to grind with Meow and Odin, but by the time I got Noah, I didn't even bother, and he stood up against the current enemies rather well while climbing up the levels fairly quickly. Of the few times I had to grind, it never felt more than necessary, and by the time I was done with my playthrough, any grievance I had with catching up party members was completely gone. Here though, because I had to grind up 6 other characters, with the final character joining close to the halfway point of the game, there was a lot more work to be done, and it became a longer process each time. If the game wanted to have all of these characters, there should have been a better way of balancing them out. Have them join at a higher level, or balance out their individual stats to where joining at level 1 doesn't even matter. Anything would have been better than this. And with each character fulfilling a specific niche, meaning switching out specific characters at certain moments is the most efficient way of playing this game, Generation 2 introducing an experience share of some kind was crucial, and I'm beyond thankful that it's here. Phantasy Star II can be a bit grindy in many instances, and combined with its relatively higher difficulty than most RPGs of that time, hell, arguably even nowadays, this is the main reason why so many of its more accessible regions have an experience multiplier of some kind. Heck, I played with one. I still beat the game at a relatively lower level than most modern RPGs, level 39 to be specific, and numbers across the board were still lower than they tend to be these days, so everything felt a lot more purposeful. And just like the original, I really liked that. I enjoyed how much longer it took to hit triple digit HP. I liked when just 10 extra points of damage made all the difference, so on and so forth. These factors made it so that even though there were a few instances where I had to stop and get stronger, I was always seeing progress made, and like with the first game, I never abused these multipliers to get higher than the game ever intended. I just cut down on the amount of time it would all take, meaning there were a ton of fights that required a bit more effort on my end, but it felt more engaging than frustrating a good majority of the time. Generation 2, despite its additional experience share, does not reach that same achievement because like Generation 1, this game features a much larger range of numbers and stats, all while requiring a higher level from the player's team to even beat the damn thing. It does, however, still remain as grindy as the Genesis version, even more so actually, since there's no multiplier of any kind, and if you don't play super well throughout battles, you'll get a less than ideal experience reward. So you may be wondering what level I was when I finally beat the game, right? Wanna hear a secret? Promise you won't get mad first, okay? Alright, here goes. I didn't, beat Generation 2? Yes, I know, I can explain. Here's the thing, I'd like to think that I've grown a pretty good tolerance for grinding in RPGs. I'd rather not, given the choice, and just have the ability to come out on top of the experience as a result of being good at the video game, but there is a satisfaction in seeing your character's stats grow stronger as the direct result of hard work, and that was something I had felt with the Genesis version. But my dudes, the growth in Generation 2 is not only way too slow, but way too small. I only have to climb up so many more levels because every number is bigger in this game. I get to triple digit HP a lot faster, so as a way to balance this out, enemies do so much more damage. Your character's healing and items aren't any stronger than they were in the original, so now I just have to waste more resources to keep up with it all, and as soon as I do, the enemies jump up in strength yet again, meaning even more grinding. Even without the multipliers in the original, you could at least go a little bit without having to stop and train. Here it feels like every dungeon is another opportunity for new enemies to curb stomp you, and it's so draining. I get that the challenge works with the game's theme of never giving up in the face of indescribable challenge, but the original struck a balance with that and letting me feel like it actually stood a chance. I was able to overcome it all because I was allowed to progress a decent amount after a bit of training, and the gaps that were there took no longer to close than 1 or 2 levels. But Generation 2 just has too much room for one-shots and party wipes, and then the time to lessen that space is even longer because I decided to take too great a beating in these ridiculous fights. Silly me, I guess I should just stop getting hit in a turn-based RPG. I thought I'd be down for the idea, but ranking me based on how well I do has no place in a game like this, or at the very least not in this manner. Why can't I get a baseline experience gain depending on the enemy in question that feels good enough, then get bonus experience points based on how well I do? The whole game shouldn't be dependent on my skill, especially when this game makes it so easy to get blindsided as a result of random encounters paving the way for surprise encounters. Man, I sure love these. That was a lie. I hate them. Combine all of this with battles taking even longer than the original thanks to this dumb gauge that doesn't need to be here, something I have to deal with since the ranking system punishes me for using auto battling, and you've got yourself a much worse game than the original just based on the battle system alone, to the point where I didn't even want to put up with it. This was time I could have used just playing the Genesis original again. What does Generation 2 even have over it? No, seriously, while I found it debatable in the original's case, Generation 2 just kind of sucks in comparison to the Genesis version. Maybe there was a reason this one didn't leave Japan. Ugh, sorry about that rant. Thankfully, when it comes to the Genesis version, I do find this battle system to be an improvement from the original as a result of how it's set up and the different options you have at your disposal. It particularly shines during boss battles, but there are very few of them in this game. Only 3 as a matter of fact, with an extra one being a forced loss, so I didn't count it. I'm fine with a smaller amount, and I've noticed that's just how this series works based on my time with the first game, this one, and even a bit of later entries, but it is a bit of a shame here since fighting is such an improvement. And surely the dungeons are too, right? Nope. They're honestly kind of worse. Phantasy Star I's dungeons weren't the best, but I struggle to say I truly disliked them as a whole. The later ones were a headache with special mention to the final climb towards the Mad King, but it was just typical dungeon crawling shenanigans that I learned how to mitigate the further I got in. The worst part about them was their maze-like structure, but even that wasn't too terrible into the last few labyrinths. Unfortunately, this game's dungeons are a nightmare from the get-go. The very first dungeon is a multi-layered teleport maze that was so incredibly frustrating to do without an external map, so I used one. The next dungeon was another multi-layered teleport maze that was just as infuriating to do without an external map, so I used one again. The next dungeon was, get this, a multi-layered teleport maze that was just as aggravating to do without an external map, so guess what I did? That's right, I used one. Are you beginning to see the pattern? Every dungeon in this game, and I mean every dungeon in this game, is like this. Why? I don't know. I think I read in the guide to JRPGs that the designer got a little over ambitious with the hardware, but the fact of the matter is that they're not fun in the slightest and can be a pain in the ass to navigate. I'm far from the first one to point this out though, as the earliest example of people calling attention to this are the developers behind the game themselves. Okay, so here's the thing. Just about every game back in the day came with an in-depth instruction manual. We saw this with the very first game, as a matter of fact. Phantasy Star II, however, took this to the next level by including with every official cartridge a full-on strategy guide that told players where to go next, which items did what, and most prominently, featured detailed map layouts of every single dungeon in the game. I'm not kidding. Every single dungeon from the first to the very last one are laid out in excruciating detail with with spoilers kept to as little as possible, but the fact that all of this is here at all is still pretty crazy. While we were on the cusp of the golden era, RPGs still weren't very popular at the time of this game's release, so the team behind it decided that including a way to guide players through this adventure was the best method, but that brings up a lot of interesting talking points. Older games already have a rough transition to modern platforms as a result of their instruction manuals being left behind, but Phantasy Star II has it especially rough because honestly, a lot of the experience feels like it's hinged on the assumption that the player has access to this or something of a similar caliber. And I guess in all fairness, nothing's really stopping you from looking up the PDF files to this hint book or using a GameFAQs guide of some kind on your own. But even with all this, is it suddenly okay for the game to be designed the way it is? Even if the game is giving you one-for-one dungeon layouts, letting you look at exactly where everything is, where to go, and the most efficient way to do it all, does that suddenly make it all more fun and less tedious than it would have been otherwise? The hardware clearly made it possible to have such complex level design around every single corner, but regardless of the fact that the team behind Phantasy Star II could have designed their game in this way, should they have? After carefully considering it, my answer is a very firm no. The dungeons are, without a doubt, my least favorite part about this whole game. No ifs, ands, or buts, they're just terribly designed. Every dungeon is this awful maze that requires either external assistance or an unreasonable amount of time, and as a result, there's no real sense of progression as early dungeons don't feel any shorter than the ones during the endgame. Simple mistakes result in so much time wasted either due to long corridors that lead to nothing at all, or pits that make you lose huge chunks of progress in a matter of seconds. And even from an aesthetical standpoint, so many of them look so similar minus a few small details that fail to stick out, and even if they did, they'd be obscured by these stupid pipes. Why are they here? No, better question. How on earth was I ever supposed to figure out some of these pathways in order to move the game forward? So many dungeons early on require you to fall into very specific pits in order to move forward when every other pit beforehand sent you backwards. And once you do have to start falling down them, now it's just a matter of guessing which ones are correct and which ones will make you lose progress. And wouldn't you know it, one of the last dungeons in this game is designed completely around this mechanic. It's awful. There is just no possible way to enjoy this without a guide of some kind unless you have the patience of a freaking monk. But even then, who thought this was fun? Was there a guide during playtesting? Did no one think that maybe the guide's necessity was a sign that they shouldn't be going this route when laying them all out? There's no rhyme or reason when going through any dungeon in this game. No inkling whatsoever to get you to understand the best way to approach them. They are all jumbled guessing games that take forever to figure out with no puzzles or set pieces to distinguish them from one another outside of the two that house this game's 3 bosses. This guide overall seems to be the root of all of this game's major issues. The lame dungeon design being one of them, but the lack of direction in terms of where to go being the other. Again, this was an issue the first game technically had, but it was circumvented due to the open-ended design of the experience. You didn't know where to go because really, you could go anywhere. Unlike this game where there's a clear intended path to follow that the story is trying to push you through. But that story doesn't always do a good job in pushing you along the right direction, and while early areas are a bit linear and easy to piece together, soon enough you'll have so much freedom but the inability to really do anything about it, which coupled with, again, the lack of direction, makes for some potential frustration in going somewhere you weren't supposed to and dying very easily. So why wouldn't you use a guide? The game literally came with one and is arguably balanced around the fact that the player would have this. I used a guide because I felt like I needed to. I can only spend so much time wondering what I have to do before I just look up the answer. I've got stuff to do, videos to make. So that just leaves us with a very important question. Does this hint book and the game being balanced around it or any external help ruin the experience? Does the game suffer so much from it that it becomes something less than enjoyable? After mulling it over and considering multiple perspectives, my answer is a surprising no. Outside of the dungeons and being told my next destination, I practiced self-control and didn't let any external guides tell me what else to do and how to go about it. I made my own judgments for how much I grinded, how I went about battles, and how I set up my team. There is still plenty of agency the player needs to take, and I think that while it's valid to get help in terms of where to go, how you go about it all is what matters. How you go about beating this game is still on you, and thus, I was able to take ownership of what I did find to be the best parts of this game. That being the gripping story I wanted to tell and the tough as nails battles I would take part in. While I would have preferred being able to find my own way through better thought out dungeons and clearer progression, I was still able to make the bulk of my experience my very own, and as a result, I was still able to pull a ton of enjoyment from this game. Phantasy Star II has an incredibly unforgiving first impression, even more so than the first game. My first time playing it, as you all saw, resulted in me wanting to leave it alone forever, as a matter of fact. but after approaching it with a more mature mindset, having extra help at the ready, and utilizing modifiers that were officially brought into the experience as a way to save new players time, I was able to overcome seemingly impossible odds, and at the end of the day, I was even able to enjoy it almost as much as the original. I kinda loved this game when it was all said and done, and much like that first entry, I've been thinking about it a lot after watching that shocking conclusion and seeing those credits roll for the first time. The game has such a unique style that screams Genesis, while also feeling different from anything else in the console, has a banging soundtrack that's way too short for its own good, and a battle system that kept me engaged while also respecting my time through well thought out mechanics and options. Different party members have their own niches, and while not everyone is great, looking at you, Hugh, most of them made for some fun compositions and are encouraging me to try different setups in future playthroughs. While I'm not itching to immediately hop back in like I was with the first game, the experience as a whole is still up to that quality standard, and someday I will go through it all once again. There is no doubt in my mind, however, that regardless of my affection for this title, it is still very much rough around the edges. The 16-bit era is what many refer to as the time where RPGs were at their absolute peak, but it clearly didn't start that way. Phantasy Star II has a lot of design choices that should have been left behind in the 8-bit days, and I want to say that if the team wasn't rushed to finish this game in 6 months, they would have been, but alas, I guess we'll never really know. But that being said, for a game that was made in just half a year, damn was this impressive. This is such an ambitious game that set a lot of standards for what video games could be in this day and age. To loosely paraphrase my friend Switchy, the 16-bit era was when games started to feel like more than just high scores and quick action. It was about a story, growing, truly embarking on an unforgettable adventure, and Phantasy Star II really showed what something like this could look like. It pushed the kind of storytelling that could be told. It pushed how investing battles could be. It pushed how big cartridge sizes could be. It pushed the industry forward, all of which being done in great strides, with just a bit more polished, more purposeful dungeons, a more forgiving skill curve, and even more interesting character interaction than the crumbs we got here. We could have something truly incredible on our hands, and that alone is worth getting excited about. And as we saw from what preceded this game throughout this era, that's exactly what we were getting on multiple fronts, and in a way, a lot of that is thanks to this game. One that may take some work to appreciate, or heck, even the right version, since I stand by the fact that the remake dropped the ball, remains a special title all this time later, and I didn't regret any of my 15 hours spent with it. It's a worthy sequel to a great game, and an excellent showcase as to what made this era so special. With something like this in our hands, it was official. The only limit now truly were the fantastic stars themselves. I love all of my Phantasy Star reviews dearly, but I still think that this is my best of the bunch and one of my favorite videos I've made to this day, with a huge reason why being due to my relationship with Phantasy Star II as a whole. I talked about it a good amount in the video, but it can't be understated just how much of a challenge this game was to beat, even for the series standards. Still one of the hardest RPGs I've ever played, and while it wasn't always for the right reasons, I had a hard time caring because of how personal my experience was the whole way through. See, Phantasy Star II was always that one game in the back of my mind. The way it so relentlessly kicked my ass when trying to play it in the Ultimate Genesis collection never quite left my subconscious, and I had always wondered when I would try it again and if I was even up to the task. Beating the game was like a gaming bucket list item of mine, and the challenge felt satisfying to overcome. But again, this game really rides the line of that challenge being fair, and while it may be the first 16-bit RPG, its design philosophies are still very much those of the 8-bit era preceding it. That said, while I struggled to do so in my original review despite my love for it, which continues to grow to this day, I'd highly recommend this title in the same vein as the original Phantasy Star. Expect an old school experience through and through, set your mind accordingly, and play this game with a guide, and an experience multiplier, and a money multiplier, and a walking speed increase hack. So basically give it the Switch Ages treatment. Seriously, this is a fantastic experience and yet another banger in a bangin' series, but Phantasy Star II was one of those games where use of a guide borders on being a necessity. This is coming from me, by the way, the most anti-using a guide on your first playthrough guy you'll ever meet. The labyrinthian, marathon-inducing dungeons are no joke. The enemies and their strength are no joke. And having the knowledge of which party members are best used in certain situations is something you should just be able to find out real quick, with the game still delivering on the challenge factor despite that insider information. Same with those multipliers, they really just cut down on the grinding that you will still inevitably have to do, so like the Switch Ages version did with Phantasy Star I, these are simply to be respectful of your time. The game is still hard as balls even if you know where to go, what to do, or the most efficient path forward, meaning that despite my reliance on it in a few instances, I still had a wholly satisfying experience. I love how much the struggle of the characters correlates to the struggle of the player. Both myself and the party faced losses that I still think about to this day. I swear I was right alongside them. And despite how few scenes there were with real substance, I still love this story, what it meant for the series as a whole, and how it all concluded. Rolf and Ney are some of my favorite characters in the franchise. This game will always look amazing both in its sprites and portraits. The soundtrack is an actual jam, all 20 minutes of it being one of the first things I think of when I reminisce over great Genesis soundtracks. I love this game. It was the point where I started to realize that Phantasy Star in general may just be something special. At least something that would perfectly align with my taste, and that's all I really cared about. I can't say I find myself replaying it as much as Phantasy Star I. It definitely takes a lot more out of me than that game, but I know those replays are in my future. And when I'm ready to tackle this beast again, I know that by the end of it, I'm gonna have had an amazing experience. Oh yeah, I guess there was also the 2500 remake for this game too, huh? Still haven't finished it, by the way. I really didn't like it. I was more bummed about it then, but these days I'm completely indifferent to it all. It's just kind of worse in every way. It sounds worse, it looks worse, and it plays way worse. I thought Generation 1 added too many bells and whistles. This plays like a completely different game, but still tries to have the overwhelmingly grindy feeling to the point where it's so much worse than the Genesis version ever was. And with that satisfying an experience as that Genesis version provided me and will continue to do so, I simply see no need to even try and finish Phantasy Star Generation 2. I really felt the budget aspect of this budget remake far more than Generation 1, and would encourage you all to steer clear from it if I haven't scared you away from Phantasy Star 2 as a whole yet. I'll still hold out hope for an easily accessible version of the game in the same vein as Phantasy Star 1's Switch port, but for now, I suppose your current options aren't terrible. I've rewritten this script so many times, to the point where I finished one and still wasn't happy with it. I've had such a hard time putting into words how I feel about this game, more so than the past two entries. I gave myself a break between this video and the one for Phantasy Star II, despite marathoning the series when I played them, all because, as opposed to the past two games, I don't like this one. I thought it was decent my first time through, but after thinking about it and playing it some more, what little enjoyment I had slipped away bit by bit to the point where it's something I don't know if I'll ever come back to. And I hate reviewing games I genuinely don't find appealing because it's so unfulfilling. I want to talk about the positives. This channel is filled by passion, the good kind. In fact, the one time I did review a game that brought me next to no enjoyment, you can clearly hear it in my narration. Just looking at the gameplay from various entries, not only does it look like a lot of fun, but it gives me major Tales vibes. And if you know me, you know I love that series. Listen to this doofus. He doesn't want to be here, and neither do I. But even then, that was just a bad game. Phantasy Star III might not be worse, but it feels worse because it isn't just a bad game. It's a disappointing one. I loved the first two games, so I wanted to love this one, but I don't. Which I say to you in such an informal manner as opposed to the past two Phantasy Star videos because I don't want to review this game. I'm clickbaiting you guys. This is not a review, but a video essay. A video essay on why I think Phantasy Star III kinda sucks. I'm not going to be as detail-oriented as I usually am, but instead just hit the big points and get this game out of the way so we can finally dive into the fourth and final game in the original quadrilogy. I hope that's okay, because trying to write about this game like my other reviews was driving me crazy, so bear with me just this once, please. Thank you. With all that said, grab a snack and get in the spaceship if you want, because we're going to be talking about why Phantasy Star III is the worst of the series and an ambitious mess. But first, context. How did this game end up the way it is? Did the team behind the series lose their touch? Well, what if I told you the original team had next to nothing to do with this game? Let's take it back, because around the game's release date, April of 1990 in Japan and July of 1991 overseas, the legendary Sega vs. Nintendo battle was underway. And on top of the typical aim of making higher quality content, a big part of Sega's strategy was to make a special game in particular that would knock the big end off of the gaming throne, meaning all hands were on deck and nearly the entire team behind Phantasy Star I and II were a part of the group responsible for crafting the Mario Killer. Important figures in making the original two games so great, such as Rieko Kodama and the Video Game Insider Trader, now had their hands tied with an incredibly important Sega title. That's right, it's Alex Kidd. Yeah, it's Sonic. It had to be Sonic. This game rules, and was the key crucial element for toppling the opposition. Clearly, Sega had their priorities, and in this particular instance, Phantasy Star was not one of them. But that's not to say it was completely forgotten. After all, Sonic alone couldn't carry the Genesis. Well, at least, not yet. Of course, this couldn't be the only Genesis game. Other titles were being developed, and there was a demand for the continuation of the Phantasy Star saga. Given the fact that the team behind those games were busy with something else entirely, an almost completely new group needed to take the reins for this next installment. Almost completely, because we still had S2 on the board, the man responsible for Phantasy Star II's character profiles, who would be put in the writer and director seat this time around for the entire project. As for the rest of the team, it would be made up of the developers from Golden Axe of all games, a beat-em-up, aka not an RPG. On top of this, since the team was next to completely new, the story wouldn't be as tightly connected to previous entries as things had already been. Rather, it'd tell a side story that would still fit in the timeline, just not be necessary to get the whole Phantasy Star experience. Not to say that it's mandatory to play Phantasy Star I before 2, but I strongly believe it was intended for players to experience the series in chronological order, as you could start to see the bigger picture getting that much clearer as you went on. Phantasy Star III would be a contributor nevertheless, but not a requirement, be it due to the team not wanting to interfere with whatever plan was at play, or for the sake of creative freedom. I doubt that we'll ever really know, and I don't really care. The fact of the matter is that this game was made by an entirely different group, designed in a way that tries to replicate the feelings those past two games were able to convey without actually getting it, something that goes for both its gameplay and story. Again, Phantasy Star III's contribution to the overarching narrative is fairly loose, with the next game only acknowledging this entry in a missable side event, which that right there was already something difficult to work with. If it's so unimportant to the story we've been building thus far to the point where I can confidently skip it, especially now that I am interested in the bigger picture after how the second game ended, then why should I care? Whatever we're doing in this game has nothing to do with anything, a sentiment I could have looked over if this standalone story was interesting, but it's not, so I can't. What is this story, you ask? Well, it's one that follows a man named Reese, who goes on a quest to the neighboring rival kingdom after his bride-to-be was stolen at the altar. A simple goal, all things considered, which the game agrees with, because it'll only be a few hours until you rescue your special lady. However, this game is called Phantasy Star III Generations of Doom because at that point, you'll be given the choice on who you want to marry. From there, you'll be taking part in future generation stories that introduce new conflicts, all a part of a narrative that kinda, sorta connects, I guess, leading to one of 4 endings. The protagonist changing based on the character you decide to marry, branching paths leading to multiple endings, entirely new storylines to look forward to on subsequent playthroughs. Doesn't that all sound so cool? I thought so, and was excited to play this game primarily to see this in action. But of course, this is where the problems really start to show their face. Marriage in this game is a choice decided entirely by which design you like more, because these characters, once again, have no character. In fact, the cast is even bigger than it was in Phantasy Star II to compensate for these multiple timelines and branching routes. Can we please make the roster good before we start to bloat it up? It can't be that hard to write meaningful dialogue, can it? Have someone comment on the weather or something, crack some kind of dumb joke, recommend the viewers check out my Patreon linked in the description. Anything, at least try. Whenever characters do talk, which is already rare enough, it's just expository nonsense devoid of any personality, in one ear and out the other. All of this comes off especially odd this time around, not just because it's the 3rd game in the series, but the director was the man behind the character profiles in Phantasy Star II. Making a good cast was his role the last time, so why does it feel like they didn't even try here? I don't care who I marry, they mean nothing to me. I would have killed for a maidenless route. Let me just chill with my cyborgs and call it a day. And I do mean let me just chill, because this story was not fun to follow in the slightest. Just a bunch of go here, do this, talk to that person, fight what's his name, who I guess is important to the plot now. There was no build up to anything. Stuff just happened, and it was due to a lack of engaging dialogue or proper world building that I didn't give a crap about anything. There was a massive lore dump right near the end of the game on this world's entire backstory, completely missable by the way, and I guess that was kinda cool, but even then, it's so late in the story that I'm already well past checked out. I'm doing the things the game wants me to do because I'm going through the motions. My heart's not in it, and I kept asking myself why I wasn't moving on to the next game that's supposed to be the best one. I was originally gonna go for all 4 endings. After the second one, however, and getting partway to the other 2, I could feel my energy waning. I wasn't having fun, and the game's stories weren't as different as advertised. In fact, you go to the exact same locations even if it makes no sense within the context of whatever story you're going through. It's to the point where I ran into the same exact NPCs who said the same exact things, even if my current party should have no idea who they are. If these maps were designed with only one route in mind, then why make me go to all of them in each playthrough? The answer? To pad out the game, and once I realized that this was the case, I saved myself the time and turned off the Genesis, or PS3. I played this on the M2 collection on the Japanese PSN. I'm telling you, man, those experience multipliers are a hell of a time saver. The idea for multiple generations was incredibly ambitious, and it's a great concept. In execution, however, this simply rearranges content rather than adding any, and I don't think that was the idea. If it was, then I take it back. Multiple generations were a mistake. A mistake that not even the gameplay could save, because while it's not that bad, it's also not that good. Let's start with the dungeons. In Phantasy Star II, the problem was that these were over-designed to the point of frustration. In Phantasy Star III, the problem is now the exact opposite, under-designed to the point of dullness. Every single dungeon is the same, one big room with different walkways that either lead to the object of story progression, treasure, or nothing whatsoever. There are no puzzles, set pieces, or unique layouts of any kind, and as a result, everything becomes so incredibly uninteresting. Points for not forcing my hand at using a guide, but I ended up using one anyway because these things were so lame. I just wanted to get them out of the way and there was never anything to look forward to. I would enter a dungeon and just want to know the quickest way to move on while grabbing a chest or two. I almost found myself missing the needless complexity of Phantasy Star II because out of both extremes, I honestly prefer that to this. There, I was so incredibly frustrated, but hey, you can't say I wasn't invested. Here, it felt like my brain was constantly deteriorating the more I'd advance into the game. Sorry for expecting something from these dungeons. It's not like the overworld had anything interesting going on. Where's the anything? Traveling in general has zero stimulation, no unique layouts, no eye-catching landmarks, nothing. It's all one big blah, and that was so frustrating to play through. Seriously, why is everything so boring? Where's the creativity, the charm? Even if you didn't know the history behind this game, I wonder if it'd be so hard to piece together that this was made by the B team or a group inexperienced with the genre. This ain't Phantasy Star, this is a generic by-the-numbers RPG. It's soulless, and if I'm being honest, a part of me kinda knew this was gonna be the case as soon as my first encounter. And we're back to the first-person view, huh? Woo. Oh well, at least now nothing's distracting me from these great enemy designs like Evil Moose, Green Circles, and Floating Face, all of which with their eyeball-busting 16-bit animations consisting of the flick of a finger and David Hasselhoffing pecs. Do I really need to tell you all that the Sega Genesis can do better than this? No? Great, let's move on. When you're finally done gawking at whatever the hell this is supposed to be, you'll take note of your options, auto-battling or choosing your actions manually, be it attacking, defending, magic, using an item, or running away. Easy enough, and the past games didn't have anything too wild or stand out either. How they made up for this, however, was with their difficulty. Both games were relentless, and coming out on top made me feel incredible, like I really earned that victory. Phantasy Star III is the easiest in the series. Not a problem in and of itself, but because of how simple combat is, this once again made things very mundane. You would not believe just how much I auto-battled in this game without any sort of strategy. Not like I needed one, so why bother? The only fight where it felt like I had to try was the very final battle, despite this game having a decent amount of bosses. At the very least, it has more than the previous entries, but they were so understated that they didn't even have a boss theme associated with them. At least in those past games, you actually felt like the few bosses there were special bouts worthy of your attention. Here, you'd be forgiven if you didn't even realize you were fighting a boss. God, this game just feels so empty. Can you see why I didn't like it? It's one thing for a game to be bad in a frustrating manner, but another entirely when it's bad in a way where you just can't bring yourself to care about it. And believe me, for as much as I tried, it's very hard to care about Phantasy Star III. No wonder the series wants you to forget about it. The game doesn't feel like it lines up with the others in terms of polish. And while I could bring up the fact that the science fantasy scale is once again in favor of one side over the other, whine about how the soundtrack is lame, leading me to use external music and official remixes, or complain about the lacking sprite work, at the end of the day, why bother? You get it. And God help anyone watching this who's a fan of this game. I wouldn't dare try to take that away from you, by the way, and I hope you leave a comment in defense of it. I want to understand what people see in this. I encourage you to explain to me as to why Phantasy Star III is good, actually. You're probably not going to change my mind, just as I'm sure this video didn't change yours, but I'd love to get a conversation going, because for me, the creative, thematic blend that grabbed my attention in the first place, the tough as nails, ball-bustingly hard gameplay that kept me coming back, and the personal experience forged within it all that got me to love these games were all missing within this third installment. The substitutes didn't get it, and as a result, the next game made sure to take its sweet time coming out so that the ones who knew what's supposed to go into these titles were behind it. Great news to be sure, but it's gonna have a hell of a hard time watching out this gross, disgusting taste in my mouth we all so unfortunately refer to as disappointment. Well, we find ourselves face to face once more. Phantasy Star III was a tricky one because it very much disrupted my high after the first two games, and the act of making a video on it was tough. But I couldn't just not make one. I was so close. And Phantasy Star IV was right there. I knew that game was gonna be good and just wanted to play it. Don't think that caused me to rush the video or anything. I still gave it the time and care I try to give all of my videos. That length was really just all I had to say. There's not much to this one, and just as my overall takeaway is the inverse of the first two games, my feelings towards it in retrospect keep that trend going because these days, I kinda think it's even worse. but with an asterisk. That asterisk being in large part thanks to the comments section, which was really enlightening. I loved having good, thought-provoking conversations with you all, especially those who respectfully disagreed. The whole lineage system was groundbreaking and in all honesty is still a cool trick to this day. The graphics were also different from the first two because they could almost have come across as 3D, especially with how they'd get fudged on a CRT, and the much more approachable difficulty, that of which going double for when you compare it to Phantasy Star II's hellish one, makes the game much more, well, approachable, causing a few of you to prefer it over the former and even rank it highly within the series itself. I can definitely say that I understand where a lot of you are coming from now and ultimately see the appeal to Phantasy Star III. That said, in understanding why some of you may like it more, it's helped me to further understand why I like it less. For starters, the lineage system was always something that interested me about the game, but when brought into the same conversation as the story, characters, and that science fantasy genre, even if it were great, it was never going to be the big sticking point here for me. As such, the little bit it truly added to the experience only served to highlight how undercooked the rest of the narrative was, having even less for me to latch onto than the first two games. Granted, a lot there was left up to my imagination, but there just wasn't anything that truly grabbed me. Relying more heavily on the fantasy side of the coin rather than the sci-fi one isn't inherently bad, it just felt uninspired here, with sci-fi elements boiling down to, hey look, a robot, or hey look, a bunch of robots, or whoa, damn, we're in outer space. It just all felt uncreative, meaning despite Mew and Ren being really freaking cool, they couldn't carry on their own. Beyond just this though, overall, the experience came off so empty, and to this day, it's the entry I think of the least. Graphics are subjective, and in my opinion, they still don't look great, and while I loved seeing the overall theme get gassed up as it really is a great song, the rest of the collection just doesn't compare or even sound all that good. I really tried to think if there was anything else that stood out to me, but nah man, that was kinda it. Then there's the point of difficulty. I don't know if I can necessarily argue against this, but what I will say is that the high level of challenge within this series is, at the very least, consistent. 3 out of the 4 are harder than this genre's average as far as I can tell, so this game being easier than the genre's average makes it an outlier, one you may find yourself preferring, but those first 2 games put me in the mindset of bringing my A game to the series, and as such, the lack of any grit or teeth on this one left me feeling underwhelmed, failing to encourage me to engage with what few mechanics were there to begin with. I really was on autopilot for all but a handful of bosses, and I just can't get down with that. All in all, you've got the perfect storm of a game that wasn't made for me, but in a way that goes against everything former entries had set me up to expect. No wonder it was disappointing, and no wonder how most praises I'd see towards this game were from people who either thought Phantasy Star II took it too far, or had this be their introduction to the series. But you know what? Let's acknowledge that asterisk. I believe that a perfectly okay experience can be yielded from this game should you spread out your playthroughs. Because of how similar the different routes really are, it feels like the game is meant to be played all the way through from the start once you've had some distance from a playthrough you may have done prior. Trying to marathon the game's 4 routes back to back despite their short length should have been recognized as a bad idea from the start. I give people flack for doing similar things in games like Fire Emblem Three Houses, yet here I was thinking I was okay because of the length, when that in actuality has little to do with why partaking in something like this is so draining. That said, I think I'll come back to this someday and wrap up those loose ends. Maybe I'll even view it in a brighter light, who can say? But what I can say now is that while I get it, for lack of a better phrase, I also get why this will never be in the same league as the other 3, and that's okay. Phantasy Star as a whole is still amazing, as even the weird member of the family has some merit to it, and that's pretty cool. Now, for those who are true Phantasy Star fans, so much so that they spell fan with a PH, you may be wondering about those other classic Phantasy Star titles, those being Adventure and Gaiden, both released on the Game Gear exclusively in Japan, a state of affairs I am all too familiar with. And you should be too, given the sequel's text adventures suffering a similar fate. But in a fortunate turn of events, like those aforementioned text adventures, these 2 games have been completely fan-translated, meaning I was able to play them and can briefly go over some thoughts. High emphasis on the word briefly though, at least in regards to adventure. Did you like Phantasy Star II's text adventures? Personally, I enjoyed a few of them for the most part, but ultimately I arrived at the conclusion that this type of game just isn't my thing, with Adventure being a text-based game as well, doing absolutely nothing to change that. The music was incredibly repetitive, and what little combat was there left a lot to be desired, so I assume that these are more for puzzle solving in the story, right? Okay, fair enough, but even then, this game is still so whatever. Puzzles were obtuse and, like the text adventures for 2, relied on me investigating every last area I'd come to while using every last item received on every last object I could interact with. This is the epitome of trial and error, resulting in something I just don't find engaging. The game only took me an hour and 12 minutes to beat, officially less time than the video you're watching right now, so I suppose that there are worse things you could do with your time. And just with that example, there are clearly better things you could do with your time too. Come on, you're enjoying yourself by this point, throw a brother a like. Anyway, in regards to the actual game at hand, it didn't do much for me, especially considering how little there was to latch onto within the story. You play as a dude rescuing his friends and machine that got stolen, and then you go back home. Spoilers? It's a standalone tale that happens between the events of 1 and 2, but with characters being a means to an end and there not being much of a theme or point to it all. This just felt like a side quest in a bigger game if anything, and I suppose that's okay. It's a quick, bite-sized quest that I will only play this one time, and I didn't hate it, so I guess that's a win. If you enjoy these types of games, maybe there's more for you here, but as for my tastes, let alone what I look for out of the series, this was one of the games of all time. Gaiden, on the other hand, oh, now we're cooking. This one's a more traditional RPG and a genre I actually give two craps about, so naturally I had a lot more fun. Interestingly enough, I'd say that it felt even more old school than the classic that started it all, having you buy spells instead of learning them through level ups, the game really not telling you where to go and what to do, and just expecting the player to get lost in a relatively small overworld. As such, figuring out what needed to be done next wasn't really an issue, and I found myself not needing to use a guide much here because there was only so much I could do at a time, with enemy levels and strength invisibly nudging me in certain directions. On that note, I was surprised how often level jumps presented themselves to me, given how I'd constantly get launched into encounters over and 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 over again. Good lord, this encounter rate was worse than the Generation games. At least battles went by quickly here, and the game is nice enough to give you a spell later on that negates encounters entirely, which was awesome. 70 MP though? Not awesome. Battles were simple in the same vein as the first, with the game mostly relying on exploration and figuring out how to go about certain events, making for an experience I would describe as Phantasy Star Light. And just like that game, I had a lot more fun than I thought I would. It's just that in having less meat on its bones when it comes to the areas it expects you to indulge in the most, it fails to reach those same highs the original was able to enjoy. There are also way too many level checks and jumps, especially compared to every other entry. The game is only 8 hours or so, but if it chilled on how much the levels scale over such a short amount of time, it could have been cut down even further, and I would have been totally okay with that. I grinded almost as much in this game as I did Phantasy Star II, but the amount of times I would need to grind here eclipsed even that one. Compounding this issue is the fact that I wasn't only grinding for experience, but for once, I was a broke boy. Or girl, since we've got two protagonists, Alec and Mina, but dog! Why the hell is equipment so damn expensive? There were many a times where I wasn't even grinding for levels, but cash so that I could actually deal more damage and take more hits. Them prices way too high, you need to cut it. Despite my issues, when the game just let me vibe, aka when I finally got that repel spell, I was pretty much smooth sailing. The sprite work is solid, that of which being especially impressive given the Game Gear's hardware, and while the soundtrack was small, songs were catchy and a lot more pleasant on the ears than I was expecting. Those low expectations being thanks to adventure, if that wasn't clear. And hopping into a Discord call or playing a YouTube video while I grinded turned out to be a relaxing experience, as I discovered grinding could be in that original game I love bringing up so much. Though on that front, I do wish that I got to experience the game in the way it was intended, on a handheld. Gaiden is definitely a game that could benefit from chipping away at it bit by bit, pulling it out of your pocket and doing some battles real quick before putting it right back. Especially given how little actual dialogue and storytelling there is outside of the beginning and end portions, there's a lot of room to play at your own pace, making for another solid entry in a solid series. And you know what? Despite how little dialogue there was here, since the game has you primarily follow Alec and Mina, I actually ended up really liking the two in the same sort of way I felt for the Phantasy Star I cast. Man, this game really is Phantasy Star Light, huh? It's pretty freaking good all things considered, and I could definitely see myself coming back to it in the future. Especially if I could somehow get this thing on a proper handheld, whoo boy! 8 hours well spent if I do say so myself, and a standout on an admittedly mediocre system. Sorry Game Gear, I know you're trying your best, but try harder. We're finally here. Phantasy Star I, the start of something new and a trailblazer of an RPG that pushed the Master System beyond the limitations it was once believed to have. Phantasy Star II, a daring sequel that yearned to take the series in a bold direction for the sake of a gripping narrative only possible on next-generation hardware. Phantasy Star III, an ambitious, if flawed game that a new team tried their best to bring to the same heights as the previous two entries. With varying levels of quality, time constraints, and a market still not fully accepting of RPGs among other things, it's no wonder this series found itself in the odd position it was in after these 3 games. What it needed, what fans of the series needed, was a game to put the main story back on track and have the entry be designed by the ones who grabbed our attention in the first place. A sentiment that thankfully Sega agreed with. In fact, things were looking much better development-wise already, as the team themselves wanted to begin work on a new entry right as the company tasked them with the very mission. They weren't crunched for time, the team wasn't split apart, and no crazy deadlines were thrown onto them. This game was given a proper amount of time to really cook, coming out 3 years after Generations of Doom. Compare this to the annual releases of the preceding games, mayhaps the company learned that rushing games isn't the way. Oh, yeah, sorry. Yeah, I couldn't say that with a straight face. Within those 3 years, the game saw a lot of changes, at one point even being planned for the Genesis CD add-on before switching over to the standard hardware. Would have been cool to see how that turned out, but either way, the team was trying to go big with this one. Remember how Phantasy Star II's 6 megabit cartridge was the biggest game on the market at the time? Yeah. This game was 24 megabits. The rate of progression back then was crazy. Hell, upon release, many were already looking towards the next generation of consoles with true groundbreaking 3D graphics. As a result, this and a few other late Genesis games were unfortunately overlooked, but in retrospect, it seems to me that this is the most popular game in the series by a lot. Just talking about the franchise as a whole with fans, the first games to come up are the online titles, and this one, specifically this one. Not Phantasy Star I, II, or III, but Phantasy Star IV. At a glance, it seems that the team achieved their goal, making the biggest, best Phantasy Star possible, which is a good thing because alongside that, it was also meant to be the last. Yep, you heard that right. This was it. The series story was reaching a natural boiling point, so why not let that bad boy sizzle? Mad respect to the team for acknowledging that this would be the best stopping point rather than letting it go on for too long, and I knew this was the case even when I was simply playing the first game. But my dudes, it's one thing to be told that Phantasy Star IV is the last chapter. It's another entirely going through the series game by game and experiencing that massive, meticulous build-up firsthand, starting to piece together all the crazy lore, becoming invested in the plot threads developing further over each entry, and yearning to have my questions answered. For it all to come to a head in one, well, explosive finale was hype. And supposedly the game's a banger? Oh man, I was trying to keep my expectations in check, but I was so excited that I almost skipped Phantasy Star III to hop in already. Confession, I did play like an hour of it before deciding to give 3 a chance, but man, I really wanted to play this game. A few of my friends even played this one, or at least more aware of it than the rest of the series. Can I add this to the group of 16-bit RPG greats like Chrono Trigger and Final Fantasy? Will this become a prime example of Sega deserving to be acknowledged as a source of role-playing greatness? Will this be the best Phantasy Star? I'm so excited! The series was taken care of in full up to this point, and there was nothing standing between me and the game. Shaking with anticipation, I booted up my totally legit Genesis and... expectations. Hype. 2 very dangerous things. It's more often than not a bad omen to go into any game with an idea of how you want it to be. That tends to lead to inevitable disappointment. But sometimes, the game just gets it, and Phantasy Star IV gets it! December 1993 and February 1995 were the times both sides of the world were graced with, yes, another shining result of JRPG's golden era. The lessons learned from previous games, taking everything that worked and expanding upon them in ways I was not only hoping for, but didn't think would happen? Yeah. The game's good. So good that we've got to get into the nitty and gritty because there are a lot of factors that make it so good. So grab yourself a glass of water, get comfortable, and hop into the freaking spaceship, loser! It's time to bring this series to a worthy end with my revolutionary review for Phantasy Star IV, End of the Millennium. Oh, doesn't that intro song just give you chills? I was already hooked just by booting this game up, a great sign for things to come. And once the game started, the graphics are good again. Matter of fact, this isn't just good, but the best of the bunch by far. Harkening back to Phantasy Star II's visuals, I'm bumping them even further. On top of the rich colors and thick outlines, character sprites have just the slightest bit more detail to stand out that much more, along with a few charming animations to boot, with that attention to the finer points being a philosophy carried over to the whole world in its many locations. Towns, the overworld, and even those dungeons have persistent instantly stuck in my mind, if not for their layout, then for their aesthetical prowess. Everything has so much more depth and distinction, with a few areas even playing with the perspective. No two locations look exactly the same, and a sense of progression was always felt when it came to the visuals. The story begins on Motavia, and it's back to looking like a desert just as it was in the first game, but even still, it's so visually captivating and unique from how it was in both of its past incarnations. The same can be said for Dazores, as well as the boatloads of other locations that may seem a little familiar. The fan service in this game is pretty damn good, that of which I'll get more into later, but whenever I was looking at it all, at the very least, my eyes weren't complaining. Battles are also back to the third-person perspective, with animations across the board having more frames and detail. That goes for both you and the enemies, by the way. It truly feels like we're taking advantage of the more powerful hardware this time around. As you may have noticed, we're not on the Tron grid anymore, but instead, taking a page from the game that started it all and giving battles unique backdrops that correlate to where you are at the moment. In fact, both the world's visuals and monster designs made an incredibly exciting fact that much more apparent. That being the science fantasy blend is finally seamless, balanced, and as natural as it always should have been. We're not leaning towards one side more than the other, we aren't saving another half of the coin for later in the game, we aren't particularly one genre while sprinkling elements of the other here or there. No! This is a science fantasy, with the two working together as well as I knew this series was capable of, as well as this series showed us it was capable of in 1989. You know what? Better late than never. And in a weird way, the previous two entries being as unbalanced and biased as they were helped to make this game's thematic cohesion feel all the more satisfying. One way or the other, it is good to be back. I'm telling you guys, this creative back and forth is so important because it gave the original game a brilliant art direction and memorable vibe, all of which going double for this game because this is 16-bit. This is the Sega Genesis. And because this game takes as great advantage of the system as it does, combined with a brilliant art direction, this game is gorgeous, inside and out. On top of what we already said, just look at these characters. And for those who've been sticking with the series, or heck, just my videos, keep a keen eye out. Most of this cast visually derives from an important figure in the past games, some more obvious than others, but all equally as fitting and deserving. Already, this was a great way to get me attached to this group, and let's just say it won't be the last. Shoutouts to the game for letting me look at them as much as I do too, not just referring to the overworld sprites, by the way, or even the battle screen. I mean the cutscenes, because we've got a substantial amount of them. I'll give Phantasy Star III credit for providing an alright amount, but considering I didn't think they were all too visually impressive, Phantasy Star II was the real stinker in this regard. The breadcrumbs of art we got all looked great, and here, not only did we get so much more, but it all looks so much better, with all the convincing you need being the first one you see in the main game. Our two leads walk out of the town and my jaw hits the floor. This was the moment I knew I was in for something special. The somber sunset, dramatic shadows, familiar landscape, striking characters. Ugh! It's not even that complex, but I can't get enough of this shot. More on this particular scene in just a sec, because I ain't done gushing about the game's cutscenes on the whole. They're done in a comic style, with each panel having unique, quality art that pushes every scene to the level they need to be, to hit as hard as they need to. As a result, I was constantly pulled into the many moments, and the intended emotions were consistently felt. Not to mention, the characters were allowed to be hella expressive due to this presentational aspect. Looking good, looking good. Now back to this scene, some of you might be wondering what else there is to talk about. Well, in order for you to understand, I gotta shut up for a second. Music to my ears. That's right, gamers. They did it. They finally did it. The soundtrack isn't just really freaking good, but a competent size. I can actually stick with the game's music and its official remixes alone for the entirety of this video. It's a miracle! And what a soundtrack we'll have to accompany us. It's easily my favorite of the quadrilogy, and some of my favorite music on the system. It's seemingly unbound by the usual limitations as opposed to a majority of the Mega-driven library, paving the way for a decent amount of instrumental variety that all sounds great. Even when the music does lean into the Genesis typical twang, it's done in a more enjoyable manner than I've heard on any other OST trying to do the same thing. And I know that the actual compositions are the culprit for these songs being as great as they are, because when listening to the game's official remasters and mixes, they're excellent as well. So yeah, we'll be sticking with this game's music today, something that's apparently a lot harder to do than I thought. Anyway, I know you're all waiting for me to talk about the story, right? I mean, come on, it is the last game of the series. It's all been building up to this. No, really, it's all been building up to this. Something the opening text alone makes apparent, not shying away from refreshing or spoiling the player on key moments that previous games hosted. Which brings us to a bit of a predicament. I've been trying to keep these reviews as spoiler-free as possible, but since these are an ongoing narrative and this is literally the final chapter, the story includes a lot of big plot twists from earlier entries that are essential background information to grasp what's happening this go around. I tried to dance around it, but there's really no way to give the necessary amount of information required to understand the story without delving into those plot points that I consider spoilers for earlier titles. I'm not going to spoil this game, but I am going to spoil those games. So for the lovely viewers who want to avoid all of this, I'm going to leave a timestamp here so that you can skip my story critiques and head right on over to the gameplay side. As for you all who have played those games, already know the big plot points required to hop into this game, or just don't care, glad to see you all stick around. Let's dive in. So, after the second game especially, the Alco solar system's kinda in shambles. One of the 3 planets, Palma, the main planet from the first game, has been completely destroyed, and Mother Brain has been taken down. You'd think that at the very least was a good thing, but you have to remember that it wasn't just an evil hive mind taking control of people's lives, but the backbone for pretty much all of society and how everything worked, meaning that after its defeat, the galaxy underwent a dark age referred to as the Great Collapse, resulting in even less communication from the remaining 2 planets, and Motavia regressed back to its desert roots. But after another 1,000-year time skip, it seems like things on Motavia at the very least are getting back on track. Cities have been built once again, technology's making its way back up to the level it was in Phantasy Star II, and the biomonster situation's getting a little back under control thanks to the Hunters Guild, which is where our leads, Alice and Chaz, come into play. The 2 start the game on the job to handle a biomonster outbreak inside of an academy, but eventually they'll begin to piece together how and why these outbreaks are becoming more and more apparent. A setup that sounds very familiar to Phantasy Star II, but trust me, things go in a wildly different direction. You'll be learning about the inner workings of these planets and the reasoning behind past events, all culminating in a climactic final battle, with the journey to reach that point being good, if not a bit unfocused. No use dancing around that this game's pacing is kinda rough. It starts off great, having a clear goal and obstacle for the characters to overcome, but then, well, they do it. They overcome the obstacle, and Chaz is all like, great, we did it, right? Then something else pops up, they take care of that, but oh, now we gotta do this thing. No, now we have to do that thing. No, actually, it's this that's the problem. So on and so forth. It was very odd, and at some point, I was starting to wonder where we were going with it all. Thankfully, this problem didn't bother me as much as it could have for a few reasons. Let's start with this one. Dark Force. One of the biggest lingering questions I had while playing this series was, what the hell's up with this thing? After having it serve as the true final battle of the original Phantasy Star, I remember being extremely confused because it kinda came out of nowhere. I felt a lot better after reading the first game's manual, seeing how it was behind the King's descent into madness, but after running into it again in Phantasy Star II, I was starting to wonder what they had planned for this darkness incarnate. This time around, Dark Force plays a much more in-your-face, prevalent role as different incarnations of the creature will try their best at taking you down, something I really liked. Having the past few games to build it up certainly helped, but all of its different faces and forms provided ample assistance toward making it intriguing at the very least. Especially after getting the full picture beating this game, I'm happy to say that Dark Force is a pretty great antagonist for the series. It does a fantastic job in this game alone, being a constant threat no matter what was going on in the story. The lore behind it was kinda mind-blowing and put a lot of past events into perspective, coming off as if they had a plan for this thing since the beginning, which I seriously doubt was the case, but that's how cohesive it all came off as a result of the answers this 4th installment finally gave. It's like the whole series was a big game of chess, and I was moving some of the most important pieces. Great stuff. Speaking of those pieces, that's the other constant that kept me invested, and it brings me such great joy to say this. It's the cast. The cast! No party member slot fillers, no fluff, all hits, no skips. They are all genuinely well written. We did it! We freaking did it! Turns out that many of the team actually felt that in the last game they worked on, Phantasy Star II, most of the characters were pretty shallow. True. This time around, there was a serious effort to flesh out every single party member, which was apparent with the loads of dialogue, meaningful character interaction that doesn't always have to do with the plot, proper development and progression, and likable quirks from the start. As a result, we have the best cast in the classic series, and it's not even close. These characters are in another league, which might not sound like much given how I described my feelings towards the previous casts, but even when judged under the larger JRPG umbrella, they hold up. They aren't just good characters within the context of the series, but just good characters. I really like them, and anyone playing this game will easily find themselves feeling the same way. Alice and Chaz already set the bar pretty high in the game's opening moments with their banter and attention-grabbing personalities, with Chaz eventually becoming my favorite lead in the series. Yeah, Phantasy Star I's Alice finally got the throne. Look at that. And with that said, said, he's not even my favorite in the game. That would be Rika, with her adorable fish out of water moments and heart-tugging dialogue on multiple occasions. Rune was great as well. I never got tired of seeing him butt heads with Chaz, and some later revelations made him that much cooler. My boy Ren is back from Phantasy Star III. That was an awesome surprise, and it just goes on and on for the rest of the party. There's a core 4, but other characters come and go fairly often, which I actually really liked. I always respect when a game isn't afraid to mess with your party for the sake of its narrative. And this game loves to shuffle your setup at any given moment, but it always manages to use every character's time effectively, meaning no matter how long they were there, I grew attached due to sound writing and solid characterization. This is what I've been waiting for, and as you can tell, I ended up more than satisfied. And while they were getting all their time to shine, those unanswered questions I had with earlier titles, if Dark Force was any indication, were all acknowledged in satiating ways. It felt like every single loose plot thread from earlier titles had an intended conclusion from the very beginning. I loved learning more about Noah, the reason behind the whole solar system's existence, and I especially loved seeing older areas within a new time frame. Like I said, there's a good amount of fan service, but it's all done in a way that swerves potential pitfalls other series fall into. You don't go to past areas because, whoa, look at that series, fans, it's the thing from the game. No, it's done in service of creating and establishing a world, or in this case, worlds. You're not going to these places for no reason, they're just a part of the universe this series has been building up, meaning every location also has a rich history and a ton of substance. Because of this, the Algol solar system doesn't just feel or look alive, it is alive. It's so easy to get lost in it all because of the seemingly effortless, captivating nature, but this is the results of years of buildup. We really worked for this and are reaping the rewards at an unfathomable rate. I gotta be honest, I didn't really care that the pacing was so weird while playing the game because everything else was so enjoyable. I was just here for the ride and was getting rewarded as a series fan anyway, so I was good. Though that said, I imagine people playing this game without having experienced older titles don't feel much of anything from stuff like Rika being based off of Ney, seeing the Alice and Meow statue, Zio summoning Dark Force as early as he does, or any other things that derive from earlier titles. So perhaps coming into this game from that lens paints this narrative in a bit of a weaker light since there isn't as much to help out the awkward pacing. But seeing as I did experience earlier titles, I had a blast and found the story to be somewhat flawed but great nonetheless. The fan service and characters, along with the multitude of baller moments they all provided, made the story for me, and that ending, such a satisfying conclusion to all 4 games. I was pretty sad to see it go, but let me save all of that for the end of this review. After all, we've got to talk about the game parts of this video game, right? For starters, look at this movement speed, guys. I didn't even have to put in a mod to make it like this, which I did for literally every other game in the series. This is great, and as you can tell, is how I felt every game should have been out of the gate. Nice to know I don't need my usual M2 goodness this time around when I'm exploring, or even when I'm fighting at that. Yeah, gamers, I played this one vanilla. Are you proud of me? Prove it. Like the video, then leave me a comment specifically telling me you're proud, because that is the only way I'll know. Thanks! Anyway, as I was saying, I didn't use any of M2's multipliers. The game was balanced hella nicely, but we're kinda getting ahead of ourselves. Let's start off with the basics. As usual, they're mostly the same. Attack, defend, use text, items, or run away. But beyond that, this game introduces a few notable mechanics that round out the battle system quite well. For starters, you may notice that turns are executed in a more traditional fashion, unlike Phantasy Star II and III. You will be telling every character what you want them to do every turn. But to find a middle ground between this and the past 2 entries, we now have macros, orders you can set up within the main menu to execute specific actions in a specific order, barring any other enemies that may act in between. This is an excellent, natural progression of auto-battling that's just better in every way. Damn right I used the heck out of it over my playthrough. Another great addition is battle skills. Techs still use TP, but skills all individually have their own counters you can replenish at ends, meaning they add another layer of strategy and resource management while having their uses against specific enemies. What's more, they work especially well with macros, because if you use certain party members' skills with each other, you'll discover hidden combination techs that, usually do a good amount of damage, but never fail to look badass and flashy. Unfortunately, these aren't implemented as well as they could have, and I actually didn't even know how to use them until wrapping up some late game side quests. Oh yeah, this game has side quests. More on this later, but that's a series first. Isn't that cool? Anyway, combination techs. In order to do these, you have to pick each character's respective skills that are able to be combined, which is one thing. But the problem is that they have to be used in a specific order and the character's turns have to be back to back. You'd think that this wouldn't be a problem thanks to the macro system, but you have no way of knowing if an enemy will act in between the 2 characters since there's no displayed or consistent turn order, ruining the combination, and there's nothing you can do about this. And sometimes they just don't work, which, I mean, great. So when you do pull off these combo techniques, it's a sight to behold and pretty freaking cool, but it's not reliable, which I'll admit, is a bit of a shame. Although considering how much of the game I played perfectly fine without even knowing how to do it, it can't be that big a deal, right? After all, even at its simplest, this game remains enjoyable and engaging because it takes the series back to its challenging roots, in a way that feels the most fair at that. I had to grind, 3 times, and even then, it wasn't by much because the game gives you a lot more options to work with in order to emphasize player skill and proper strategy rather than stats. The game's not so hard to where an experience multiplier feels like a requirement, and it's not so easy to where I'm able to just mash the auto attack option through every battle. Even a good amount of normal encounters caught me off guard, which occasionally grinded my gears since I kinda wanted at least a few battles to catch my breath, but like I said in the last review, I love that this series is hard. It's one of my favorite parts about it, and this game is the best of the bunch, not just in this aspect, but at least in regards to combat, it's just the best. Period. The cherry on top, this game actually has a good amount of boss fights, notable boss fights, except for this one. This one sucked. But every other major fight, awesome stuff, challenging me and ending up as the standout moments they strove to be. They've got unique music, a few of them kicked my ass. All is right. God, this game is so good, which makes me even happier that we have some actual side content to prolong it in a valuable way. You're able to go to the Hunters Guild in order to complete requested jobs that result in you fighting some great optional fights and potentially even entirely new areas. The sense of exploration in this game is off the charts, as I found myself just stumbling upon whole dungeons that are missable, and they actually reward you with valuable items and secrets, most of which I ran into the very end of the game. Did I mention that you can miss these? This harkens back to the Master System original, where the world was your oyster and you could go wherever you wanted, which I loved. But I love this game for constantly having a set path and destination while also allowing you to go off the beaten path and find something of value even more. We're able to have some kind of focus while concurrently allowing the player to express themselves in a way the game acknowledges. And those dungeons, optional or otherwise, they're good. No crazy puzzles or anything, but they're paced better, have tons of chests to reward exploration, and a few have unique set pieces to keep them memorable. It appears that at some point they were planning to be 3D like the first game, but they go for the top-down view once more, which I, of course, prefer. So this is another aspect of the game that trumps every older title's previous attempts, being a direct improvement from all of them. They aren't hair-pulling labyrinths like the ones in 2 or way too simple intermissions like the ones in 3. They strike a balance and have some of the better, more immediately enjoyable layouts than we've seen the entire series attempt to reach. You know that this game has great dungeon design when it falls into the Phantasy Star I and II trap, having that one dungeon that's way longer and harder than the rest, yet I still loved it. It felt great to overcome, and maybe that's as a result of the fantastic fan service it housed, but it was memorable, and the boss at the very end was one of my favorites in the game. Not to mention it has a midpoint that's there to let you exit, save, and get your progress back through a shortcut, so they knew what they were doing. The positives, man, they just keep on going. There are so many more elements within the world to interact with. Tons of NPCs have interesting things to say that change depending on certain events within the story happening nearby. Entire exchanges that are missable help to develop these characters even further. The hint flavor text seen in the 2500 remakes all started here, meaning even more dialogue, and the game directs the player enough to where they don't have to use a guide. It goes on and on and on. My few major problems were ones I didn't even care about that much because the good far outweighs the bad in every instance. I kid you not when I say that the team behind this game took everything that worked from past entries, brought them back, then improved on what all that didn't work from past titles in order to make the best game they possibly could have, while introducing new ideas to round the experience out. The formula, it's been perfected. The fantasy, it's been mastered. Stars out of 10. This game is so good. What the heck? Why is nobody talking about this? At least to the extent of the other big hitting 16-bit titles, it deserves to be in those conversations when discussing the so-called golden era of RPGs. It's as unique as it is amazing, servicing fans and entertaining newcomers alike. Where I struggle to recommend older titles regardless of my affection towards them, there isn't a hint of hesitation when recommending this one. Play this game. God knows you've got plenty of ways to do it, and if you like it, maybe you'll find something to enjoy from the older titles. Who can say? Whether you do or not, that doesn't change the fact that I love this game. I adore this game. It's one of the very best on the Genesis, one of the best in its gaming generation, and in my mind, the best when it comes to the series. Phantasy Star didn't just burn out of energy when it was done, rather it concluded with a hella big bang. And as someone who saw it through from the very beginning to the very end, I was nothing but satisfied. Whether you played the previous games to reach this point or are only interested in this one, you will not be disappointed, as this is a science fantasy spectacle that deserves to be remembered for generations to come. A hell of an end to the millennium. The end. The end, huh? Man, this is really it, isn't it? This is really the end of the Phantasy Star series. Wow. You know, when I first started this journey, I didn't think it'd be one that extended beyond the first game. All I really wanted was to see what Sega's first RPG was about, and even then I was primarily gonna sink time into the 2500 remake rather than the original. But of course, as life proves time and time again, nothing went according to plan. I ended up playing both versions all the way through, preferring the 8-bit version, then dedicating a chunk of my 2022 to experiencing the 4-part Algo saga. One way or another, I found myself carrying to a level I would have never expected, and can confidently say that I'm a new fan of the series who's looking forward to someday trying the future games like Universe or the online MMOs. Later though, I would like a bit more time to just sit with the great feeling this last game gave me. It really concluded the series in the best way possible and made going through all of them worth it just on this front alone. I said earlier in the review that I was sad to see the story go, along with its world and characters, and I meant that. Palma, Motavia, and Dezoris, the classic 4 heroes, Rolf, Negi, and literally everyone in Phantasy Star IV, Algo as a whole will always hold a special place in my heart, but I truly am glad they got their happy ending and don't want to touch that. I instead look forward to more from this team because while Phantasy Star IV marks the end of an era, it's also the beginning of a new age. The team behind this game went on to form Overworks, one of my favorite divisions within the Sega company responsible for more excellent titles I'm sure we'll be talking about on this channel in the near future. And that alone is reason to get excited. This game really mattered and had an influence. It means something, not just to me, but to the company. It didn't matter if the game failed to have as big an impact upon release, we're still talking about it. The legacy is still honored, the story goes on, and with that resulting in a group as talented as Overworks, and the game in general being as phenomenal as it is, that's beautiful. Truly a fitting end to the wonderful, scientifically fantastic story known as Phantasy Star. I mean, I really couldn't put it any better myself. Phantasy Star IV is a phenomenal game and an even more phenomenal conclusion. I've loved looking back on these 4 games as a complete set, and it's so cool to see a full story with a solid beginning, middle, and end not be tampered with for the sake of cashing in on nostalgia. Phantasy Star has managed to continue, but the Algol saga is over, and that's commendable. The story overall was a joy to follow even decades after the fact from the perspective of someone born decades after the fact, resulting in a series I adore. Well, at the very least, a series ending in a game I adore. My thoughts pretty much remain lined up with my previous review entirely. If anything, I don't know if I hyped this game up enough. The characters are the best they've ever been, the sprite work is a cleaned up version of my favorites, the art direction and genre hybrid are at an all-time high, the soundtrack is the best across all the games while simultaneously being the biggest, and combat retains that Phantasy Star bite while having the most depth yet. It's a perfect sequel in every facet, while being an excellent RPG. Just what a game, man. If you're still on the fence for the past entries, I'd say it's safe to just hop into this one looking at the former titles as prequels to this. But seriously, at least play 1 and 2, those games are fire, I swear. It's something I think about constantly, and over the years, I've made the discovery that Sega secretly has some of the best RPGs ever, with this game in particular being a star player in that squad.
Pun entirely intended.
In the end of this game's review, I talked about the legacy this title left behind and how its spirit has managed to live on through the development team's other projects. Both I alluded to since then I've reviewed, those being Sakura Wars and Hot Blood and Skies of Arcadia. Today, I'd particularly like to talk about its relation with the latter, as Overworks helped more so with the gameplay in Sakura Wars, whereas Skies of Arcadia was as much their project completely as the Phantasy Star games preceding it. Both have become favorites of mine within the industry, and both reached that status primarily by embodying the X factor that's made so many Sega RPGs I've either reviewed or not yet covered, as magical as they are. That would, of course, be the sense of wonder and adventure they invoke. Both games constantly reward you for just getting lost in the world and traveling outside of the beaten path, which was an idea that, at least for the company, originated in Phantasy Star I. They're also both challenging games that not only feel satisfying to overcome, but work in the context of their stories. When the characters struggle, you struggle. When there's a tough foe hyped up in a cutscene, you feel their wrath firsthand in battles. And when the characters celebrate a hard-fought victory, you're cheering right alongside them. A philosophy I had felt back in Phantasy Star II. And throughout both stories, you're immersed deeper and deeper through characters who serve as the perfect catalysts for the player, becoming invested in their stories by way of relating to them in some way, shape, or form. Phantasy Star IV and Skies of Arcadia both showcase mastery of previous ideas packaged together to create 2 games that I can't recommend enough. While I already loved Phantasy Star IV to great extents, realizing how and why that love was formed has only made it stronger in the time since that first playthrough. And I know that once my emotions settle, it's gonna land higher on my list of favorites than I was ever expecting. This game is lightning in a bottle, but lightning in a bottle that we worked to catch. We got close at the start, again that second time, and sorta missed the mark our third chance, but fourth time's the charm. It's ours now! And with the formula down, the team ended up doing the same thing again soon afterwards. Best Genesis RPG? That ain't even close. It alone warrants the price of admission for all of those Genesis collections. I can't believe how much they hand this game out like candy when you've got Nintendo over here gatekeeping their games, with a good chunk of them not even being half as good as this one. Sorry, was that me? I don't care! Play Phantasy Star IV! Woo! And play the first two as well, I swear they're good. 3, maybe you'll see something I didn't, but at least play these. Phantasy Star truly is a gem of a series and has accelerated up my list of favorite franchises within the company, let alone gaming as a whole. I'm happy to have given them justice through my videos too. I'm very proud of these 4 reviews, glad that I finally played through the games, I'm satisfied with their performance, especially given how much I've struggled with Just Dead over the past few years, and hope you all enjoyed the journey as much as I did. High budget remakes of these games in the future would be a dream come true, but honestly, I'd be fine with another proper collection. Say a brushed up HD version of the Phantasy Star Complete Collection? This is still the best full set to this day, including those experience multipliers and increased walking speed I loved using in the first few titles, as well as all the text adventures and Game Gear entries as secrets. Imagine having all of these officially translated in proper upscaled HD with laser sharp visuals, all with the quality of life features in one Switch port, along with similar additions for the other mainline installments. Okay, the translations may be a bit of a stretch, but just having Phantasy Star I Ages adjacent features for the other 3 mainline titles will be more than enough for me. And while a part of me is still holding out for another entry that starts a new timeline in the style of a traditional RPG, as this series is right now, I'm good. How could I not be? After all, putting everything into perspective, I can't view Phantasy Star as a whole being anything less than one of this fine company's finest.